Thank you, Lorraine. That's made my day, that introduction. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're very, very welcome to this symposium. Just a couple of words of context. Here at Trinity, we are calling it open scholarship as opposed to open science. And the Dean of Research and I co-chair a task force where we've sort of bought ourselves a year to think through everything to do with open science or open scholarship. And just for those who haven't been to one of these events before, why we're calling it here scholarship is because the open science, European LIRU and people like that, they're using science in the European sense, the Latin sense of scientia, of knowledge. And we've found that that can be a little off-putting to some of arts and humanities, frankly. So we're using here the phrase open scholarship, just by way of explanation. Now, at Trinity, we've set up this task force, and it's cross-university, and we're figuring everything out. We're deciding or thinking through collectively, how far do we want to go in this? I know there's funders in the room, there's funders' mandates coming down the track, and this is the direction of travel, but do we want to lead, do we want to follow, and so on. And under the umbrella of this year under the task force, we have a series of events called Unboxing Open Scholarship. And they have been on all sorts of different aspects. And this one today is on evaluation. And it is around us thinking through the subjects and what does it mean for every individual and what does it mean for the university. A couple of years ago, Trinity, we were very honoured to join LIRU, the League of European Research Universities, which, as you know, it's sort of like the Ivy League for Europe. And there is a whole series of groups. They're very active. And one of them, the Info Group, produced the LIRU Roadmap to Open Science. And we are very much part of that. I would highly recommend it if you're new to this topic. It is very practical, it's very advanced, it has these steps that will take a university through to being an open science, open scholarship. At the heart of it is cultural change, which is in some ways the most difficult. Now the issue for us is that when we joined LIRU, the League of European Research Universities, our provost joined the Rectors' Assembly, and LIRU had already signed DORA. So they'd already signed the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, which is all about journal impact factor, which we'll hear about from our first speaker. But the point is, we as a university hadn't thought it through. And so that's part of what we're doing now under the auspices of the Research Committee for those who are in Trinity. So that is, I think that summarises this topic, is that there are things that are mandated coming down the track, and but also we as a community have to figure out what it all means for us. So that's the context. You're very, very welcome. We were sold out, which I think shows just how important this topic is. There are many other events which are on the Open Scholarship website, and I wish you all a very, very, very worthwhile day. I'll now hand over to Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. We are a few minutes behind time, and I am tasked apparently with keeping us on time, so onwards we must move. It is now my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today, who is Professor Stephen Curry, Assistant Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Structural Biology at Imperial College London. And he's also really, really relevant for us, of course, the current chair of the DORA Steering Committee. So, without further ado, I'm going to just hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and my thanks also to Shane for organising what looks like a very important and very exciting event here in Dublin. I hail from Ballymena in County Antrim, and Dublin is a city that I've visited many times in my youth and less frequently in more recent years, unfortunately. But it's a city, so I don't really know it very well as a city, but it's a city that's very important to me because this is where my parents met. Actually, we walked past the dental school where my father trained at that time in their life. Anyway, I'm here today in my capacity as chair of DORA, but also from a university where we have sort of signed DORA and made a start, I would say, on implementing it, because I think it really has to be a process that people take very seriously and think through the ramifications of. So I'm really pleased to be able to be part of the event that's happening here at Trinity today. And given that I have a tendency to waffle on, I am going to actually set my own timer to go off, and so that I will stop talking when it goes off, or I will wrap up very rapidly. So today's business is thinking about research impact and evaluation in an open scholarship era, DORA, funding agencies, and research culture. And there's really quite a lot there to unpack. And there are many different complicated and interlocking issues that we have to think about. You know, how do we do research assessment? How is that linked to open science, open scholarship? And how is that impacting, you know, what it is that we think of as research culture? And so there are academic questions here, but there are also political and social questions as well about what it is that we are about as scholars, as universities, as research funders. And so I want to offer a few philosophical, but also, I guess, practical observations. But this is not a very linear subject, and I think that's anyone who's engaged with it for more than 20 minutes knows that it's not a linear subject at all, because you can't think of one piece without thinking about the ramifications of another. And my journey through this has been complicated, and my talk will be similarly non-linear in all probability, but let's see how that goes. Form of research evaluation, which touches on some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. And then also, why is openness linked to moves to bring equality, diversity, and inclusion into the core of our thinking? And here I'm wearing the hat that I wear most of the time at Imperial these days, but I have increasingly become aware and started to think about the whole open science and open access movement is really very much about rethinking the place of the academy in society, and it's about thinking about all of society and how all of society might interact with the academy and benefit from what it is that we are trying to do. And I'm very pleased to see in your document, or your pamphlet that's been produced for this, that sort of one of the 4 key principles is about equity of access. And I think that's an issue that a number of commentators have touched on over many years, but I think it's one that is increasingly, and I now see it as moving very much to the heart of what we're talking about. And sort of linked to the motivations behind both of these questions, you know, the answer really lies in the fact that the values that are sort of motivate these questions, that thinking about openness and research evaluation and openness and equity, are, you know, the values that underpin those questions are the same. And the motivations are the same for many people, because I think most scholars, most universities exist and have their being in order to make the world a better place. And that is a phrase that I hear frequently from funders, from provosts, from many academics, but it's one that we too easily lose sight of in the hurly-burly of the everyday and the machinery of scholarly communication and research evaluation. So I will sort of roll back to the big picture and introduce you to Ariana. So Ariana is the little baby here, and this is her mother, Maria. And Ariana was born in Brazil, but while Maria was carrying her, she was infected by the Zika virus, and so Ariana suffers from microcephaly, which we now know is associated with Zika virus infections, but we didn't know that until recently. So Ariana can look forward to a life that will be marked by widespread tissue and cell death, shrinkage of the brain, impaired cognition and motor functions. She may have hyperactivity, suffer from brain seizures. She may go blind, and is likely to lead, you know, lifelong intensive care. Now, when in the run-up, it was in the run-up to the Rio Olympics in a few years ago, Wellcome sort of led an initiative among the research community in order to try and accelerate the pace of research into Zika virus infections. And what they did was they got a bunch of funders together and most of the major publishers in the world to come to an agreement whereby they would encourage researchers to share their data and their results as quickly as possible, get them out there on the internet so that they could be shared by the whole community, so that the community could try and figure out whether there really was a link between Zika infection and microcephaly. This was a major public health crisis and they wanted to work the problem as quickly as possible. And it turns out that there is a very credible link, and that is now paving the way. It's highlighted the importance of Zika research and paving the way to further research into vaccines and antivirals, because that initiative came too late for Ariana. But what it showed, that incident, is that we very much have a scholarly communication system and a research assessment system that is working directly against the public interest. Now, the public don't know this yet, okay? But if they were to find out, I think they would be horrified, okay? And if this was I'm not even sure if this initiative is still going on, but if this initiative was important for the crisis to do with Zika, why are we not doing it for HIV infection or TB or research on malaria, which have affected many more people than are affected by Zika virus, which is a relatively recent infectious disease? Or when we think about other areas of research, climate change being the obvious one, given the strike that's on Friday. These are matters where scholarship and research has directly impacts the public interest, and I think we as a community have to sort of step up more to our responsibilities to meet that. So we really need to change the system, and openness is really about that change. Now, this is a major problem, but it's nobody's fault, okay, in the sense that it's also everybody's fault, okay, and therefore everybody's responsibility to do something about it. We didn't mean to get here. Journal impact factors were invented as a tool for librarians to sort of try and decide which were the best journals to subscribe to, but have infected the whole process of research evaluation, and so now my PhD students and postdocs tell me that they feel they will not have a career unless they are publishing in the top journals. Okay, and that's a much more intense concern than I remember feeling sort of 25, 30 years ago when I was sort of setting out on my research career. Again, league tables created as a service to prospective students, but I could wax horrified and outraged for a whole hour on the iniquities and the intellectual dishonesty and dissembling that goes on in the construction of almost all university league tables. They are stuff and nonsense, and we should pay them no attention whatsoever, and yet we have to. And I do feel for anyone who's a university vice chancellor or provost. This is the market, this is the real world. You cannot ignore this, and yet ultimately these things are, I think, causing tremendous harm. And so we know, those of you that are academics and those of you that sort of work with academics will know that, the sort of obsession with journal metrics, with book publishers, if you work in the humanities, and the prestige that's associated with them, can be terribly corrosive. We know that, the chase for high impact factor publications, it slows down publication. People will wait months and months and months to get into the right journal. Okay, I met somebody a couple of years ago who is a fellow of the Royal Society, has nothing left to prove, and she told me that she had spent 18 months and going to 10 different journals trying to get a piece of work published that she thought was among the best that she had produced in her whole career. And yet she had wasted 18 months on a manuscript that was ready to go, was full of quality science, but submitted that delay. Perhaps not for her own interest, maybe she was thinking of the junior members of her team, for whom it still really matters, but these are the sorts of ridiculous things that we do, and I think that we should stop doing. We get a positive bias in the literature, which is of, I think, particular concern when it comes to medical research, because impact factors are an advertising tool for journals. They only really want papers that are going to be cited, and therefore they're not interested in negative results. And yet negative results are a very important part of the scientific and research corpus. They help to sort of close off blind alleys and avoid wasted effort by future researchers, and yet we don't really have good avenues for them in our traditional model, although they are opening up, I think, with preprints and mega journals. And we now have a system where, competition is good and it's healthy in many ways. It sort of drives and stimulates people to be ambitious and to try a bit harder. But I think we now have to recognize we're in a state where we have hyper competition within the academic environment. Universities feel it, and it's transmitted then down to academics. It incentivizes fraud. The one behavior that tracks most closely with impact factor is retraction rate. Okay, and that will tell you, if you give people a target, people are people, and people as human beings, we're all flawed, we are all sinners. And that is the kind of, if you are looking for a streamlined story, you are perhaps going to forget about the experiment you did last Friday that seemed to produce a result that was counter to the nice, clear narrative that your top-tier journal is looking for. And one hears lots of anecdotes about authors coming under pressure to produce those. And so if that's what's incentivized, that's what people will do. Now, at the moment, I think cases of fraud do occasionally occur in the press, but it's probably only the tip of the iceberg, and it does undermine public trust. And I think we do have a duty now that the vast majority of universities across the world, they are independent, autonomous institutions for the most part, and that's a proud tradition in the UK, certainly, which I think is replicated here in Ireland. But of course, there's a lot of public funding goes into universities these days, and so that the responsibilities that come with that. I'm a great believer in academic freedom, but I'm also a great believer in academic responsibility, and I don't think we hear enough discussion about what is academic responsibility. And the competition undermines other important activities, teaching, for example, which I think is a very important activity that goes on at universities, but tends PhD students and mentoring postdocs, bringing on the next generation of scholars and researchers. Those are all things that I think are very important and that are that really do matter, but often they're not counted. We have the focus on assessment tends to be on outputs. It's on, have you got the paper, have you got the book? And we forget really about the people that produce those outputs. Frank Miedema from the University of Utrecht has written very thoughtfully of this, and I think he recognizes something that I believe in as well. People come into a life, a career in academia with the very highest aspirations and noble ideals. They're deeply curious about the world and want to discover new things, and in many cases the motivation for that is to try and apply that knowledge to make the world a better place. But they get sucked into our system of worrying about prestige and journals and research assessment, and it's all about thinking, okay, what do I need to do to get to the next stage? And people that they need to live, they need to bring home a salary, and they're looking for an established career, and there's an awful lot of people working very precariously. So we forget about the things that matter. So there was a letter or a blog post from Jeremy Farrar, who's the director of the Wellcome Trust, which I think shows an acknowledgement of these problems and a sort of deep engagement, as we're seeing here, with what we're going to do about them. And and it's very much a message I hope will hit home at Imperial, because at Imperial we obsess about excellence as well. And I know that the Wellcome Trust, it's all about, and many funders and many universities, it's all about producing really top work. It's all about producing excellence in what we do. But that has come at the cost of forgetting about the human factors there and the human cost of that. So a science that cares exclusively about what is achieved and not about how it is achieved, that's our obsession now. But he hears, and I've heard it too, people tell me about destructive hyper-competition, toxic power dynamics. We have developed a culture which, however unintentionally, it can be hard to be kind. Okay, so let's all think about trying to be kinder to one another. It's a simple, almost a childish method. My youngest daughter, when I asked her, we used to walk to school together when she was at primary school, and I asked her what was her philosophy of life one morning. We tried to have deep conversation, and she said, be kind and do your best. And I haven't thought of a better way to encapsulate what would be a well-led life. So people are thinking about that, and I think the sort of thinking about the problems of scholarly communication, stirred up by moves to open access, I think, have helped to broaden out the debate that we're having about research assessment. I mean, I got into this space first sort of thinking and writing about open access, and to create a space for open access publications, you actually have to think about how we do research assessment, because of course the established journals sort of dominate the marketplace, and it's about rethinking what's important. And I think there are important broader messages that that are important to the academy, but also important to the public at large. And so I think, making the argument for open access and for, I'm open science, I've used open science, open scholarship, I think there's a very powerful and credible argument that can be made that, open science is better science, open scholarship is better scholarship. We've seen the rise of preprints, pretty well established in some areas of physics, obviously for like 25 years or more, but now in recent years come into the life sciences, which is my home territory, and moving out into other disciplines. And what I like about preprints is it completely solves the problem of people waiting on their manuscript before it can be published to the journal, because there is now an outlet to get it published straight away. And I think there's a subversive aspect to the rise of preprints, because it forces people to focus on the content and not the wrapper, not the title of the journal that the work is published in. You've actually got to engage with, what does the title of the paper say? What's in the abstract? Am I interested enough to read further? And so you start directly engaging with the content. It also encourages more moves to open peer review, because preprint servers those that offer commenting services tend to get more comments than any journal has had when they've experimented with that type of feedback. And I think it's helping to shift the journal publishing industry towards thinking about embracing more open modes of peer review, which I think is good for review and good for the sort of transparency of scholarship. And I think also encourages authors to be more responsible and reliable when it comes to putting their work out online. Open access, of course, does the same, and of course open access and preprints give one a worldwide audience, and that gives the largest possible number of people to scrutinize your work. And so although there are some concerns about preprints, well, they're not peer reviewed, what's the quality there? My own view is that actually in the vast majority of cases, most of the quality is there in the paper that's written and submitted to the journal. Peer review is a useful function. I still believe in peer review, but let's not kid ourselves that it's the be-all and end-all, or that it is a cast-iron guarantee judgment between what is good and what is not good. It helps to burnish and polish and improve papers as it passes through the hands of peer reviewers in the vast majority of cases. And so I still believe in it, but I think there's still a lot of quality out there in preprint. Of course, we're thinking now open access leads one to think about data sharing and how one does that. That's a really big challenge. Okay, computerization and digitization has, of course, given birth to the whole idea that you could do open access, and of course you can do data sharing with that, but it's technologically a lot more challenging, and there are very specific disciplinary challenges that one has to think through. Some disciplines generate way more volumes of data than others, and it's not about simply putting the file on the internet and letting people get on with it. You have to think about how you curate that, what metadata you put in it, and how you enable then people to use and access the data. And all of these movements are important about for sharing or for changing the world, because they help to increase the impact of the research that we do. But most of these benefits then are cast as sort of broadcasting from the academy to the rest of the academy and to the rest of the world. But in fact, openness and moves to open access are actually really changing the way that we think about what it is that we do and how we relate to the rest of the world. So this is a chapter that I wrote for a book that was published last year. This was my first foray into the social sciences, and my God, does it take them a long time to get things published. I think I finished this chapter in July 2016, and it was finally published in early 2018. I mean, I don't know, I'm in the natural sciences. This was a new, that was fast, okay. But I opened this chapter with a quote from a sort of childhood hero of mine, James Burke. Hands up if you know who James Burke is. Oh my God. No. So he was kind of the face of science on BBC TV in the 70s, whatever. He was the one who covered the moon landing. Remember the moon landing? It really happened for BBC. Anyway, he used to be ubiquitous on TV and did a lot of sort of history science, but he has this quotation which I really love. The main thing, it seems to me, is to remember that technology manufactures not gadgets, but social change. And I think that is true of the digital technology that has changed our relationship with the way that we can transmit and share information, scientific and scholarly papers and journals. And so, there's a lot more to open access than just putting your paper on the internet and saying, here you go, world, you can benefit from my largesse. And it's about opening up conversations and inviting people into the academy to participate in new ways. And so for me, it really raises questions about, how should the academy think about its democratic accountability, and that's something that's changing with the way that governments think about how they fund and what they're looking for. Now, often they're looking for impact, and often that can create tensions. And I know here in Ireland there have been tensions around that. What is the appropriate balance between blue skies research and applied research? Okay. Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that's a question that it's reasonable for any government, any democratically elected government, to ask of the Academy. And I think that's a conversation that the Academy should definitely be involved in, but they're not the only stakeholder, okay? The rest of society is also a stakeholder in that. And open access and inviting people in and discussing about why you think your work is important are important aspects of that. And open science is about enabling people to be a sort of engaged part of that conversation. And there are many groups already that are really interested in that. Patient groups interact in a very highly sophisticated way with the primary literature. They have a very strong vested interest in understanding the latest medical research in the various diseases that have affected their families and loved ones. Environmental action is another really important area, quite controversial, and citizen science is, I think, a growing area. But I think there's even more than that. The openness is about thinking again about who makes up the Academy, and this Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative I think is a recent sort of expression and exploration of that, which is led by Cameron Nayland, who's a sort of long-term open access advocate. He used to be the director of open science for PLOS, the Public Library of Science, and they are sort of thinking through about, I think they're developing tools to try and help universities understand how open they are. So I think there's a sort of a free dashboard tool will be available in the coming year or next few months. But they've also, really sort of thinking about how should universities reposition themselves and rethink, their own missions if we have a world where we are thinking about exploiting and leveraging all the opportunities we have for sharing knowledge. And that raises questions about equity, as we've already sort of seen. Even in terms of who pays for open access, for example. It's all very well for relatively wealthy European nations and North America to sort of suck it up, as it were. But what about the global south, where most of the world's population lives, okay, and where there are major problems that, as a global community, we should think about solving. So that's a nut we haven't yet cracked, but it's one that we really have to engage with. How do we address universities are not going to solve global economic inequality, but I think we have to deal with it in a very constructive way. And also, the whole idea of openness raises the question of who gets to be in the Academy. And that's the whole series of questions around equality, diversity, inclusion. Across Europe, only 25% of professors, thereabouts, are women. Okay? Why is that? Is that right? Is that fair? My answer is no, it's not right, it's not fair, but it's, why has that happened? And that's partly because of just the sort of, that's to do with ways of, who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets assessed. And when you have an academy that is then dominated by men, and then perhaps also, certainly in the UK, dominated by white men, then they get to dictate the agenda. And I think openness is about opening yourselves up, exploring the existing power dynamic that's associated with the status quo, and asking, if we are thinking of ourselves as international institutions, which I'm sure Trinity, like Imperial, does, we've got to think about how open we are to thinking about the problems of the world and to listening to the people of the world, a very diverse people of the world, about what it is that they want and letting them in to have the academy. Okay, right, 4 minutes, slide 10. And OpenCon is a sort of a group of early career researchers that is thinking through these and has already then embraced this idea of moving equity and ideas of equity to the core. So it's no surprise, I think, that the sort of a rise of open access has triggered sort of rethinking about how we go about research assessment. This is a brief history. There are links. I'm very happy for the slides to be shared, so you can follow those up. But things like, so DORA came along in May 2013. Then we had the Leiden Manifesto, which was thinking about responsible metrics. That was a message that was very much taken up and echoed by the Metric Tide report, which was produced in the UK. And then this is a publication exploring the sort of history of how we got into this situation in the first place. And again, it's sort of propelling this debate towards openness. So let me tell you a little bit about DORA and what we're about. So DORA is a declaration on research assessment, and it's really very much a campaigning organisation that is trying to get the various stakeholders in the scholarly communication landscape to rethink how they go about it. Now, we are best known as an organisation for being down on the impact factor. Do not use journal-based metrics such as journal impact factors as a surrogate measure for the quality of individual research articles. So it's really about focusing the content. Oh my God, I am so far behind. Focusing on the content, not the not the wrapper, not the brand. And so it is seen as something that we loudly and vocally criticise the impact factor, but in fact the declaration does run on past that first paragraph, and there are in fact 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders, for institutions, for universities. It's about being explicit about the criteria, and of course this day today is really about thinking through that and then being open and transparent with your community about what it is and deciding as a community what it is you think is important and incentivizing then the behaviors and the outputs that you think are important. So the campaign has been going for 5 or 6 years now. We had a relaunch a couple of years ago because we were kind of our PR. It was run out of the sort of back office of the American Society for Cell Biology, and we didn't have a dedicated member of staff. So we now have a bunch of funders, and we're trying to grow that bunch again. Oh dear, even the computer is. I'm going to ignore that, and hopefully that will. I'll maybe just press. I don't know. What shall I do, Shane? So we have relaunched. I used to give talks on DORA, and I would ask people to put up their hand. Who's heard of DORA? And it would be 2 or 3 people in the room. So hopefully, I haven't got time to do that today, but hopefully you all know about it. And we are building momentum. So we now have over 1,500 organisations have signed. And again, we're very much mindful of trying to make sure that we are a global organisation. So in the past year, we've assembled an international advisory group, which has got representatives from all continents on the globe. And we have a roadmap for action, which is boosting the profile of the initiative. But also, we're as well as banging the drum saying GIFs are bad, we are researching and trying to promote best practice in research assessment. So we're very well aware that there are very important and difficult practical challenges in terms of getting to where we want to be, and we're very keen to extend the global and disciplinary impact. So it's an initiative that's kind of emerged out of the sciences, but we're very mindful that we want to make sure to draw in the humanities community to that. So Imperial signed DORA a couple of years ago. I had been sort of banging on about it basically since 2013 when I first heard about it when the initiative was announced. And to sort of get it embedded, you need a number of different things. And one of the things is you really need very engaged people, and preferably people who are engaged at the senior level. So I went to James Sterling, who was our former provost, to say, there's this thing called DORA, I think it's important, I think Imperial should sign it, and he sort of tasked me with going to talking to different faculty deans about, how to get them on board, okay? Because it really has to be a conversation, it can't just come from the top. I've got my Faculty of Natural Sciences to agree to it. I've talked to the engineers, I had a very polite hearing, and they kind of basically then stalled me for quite a while. And then this happened, okay? And so this is Professor Stefan Grimm, and he was a professor in the medical school at Imperial College, and he took his own life in 2014. Now, one can never be sure what someone in that position is really thinking and what drives into that situation, but it was relatively clear from the investigations that were performed subsequently and from messages that he left that part of his the awful situation that he could not face was to do with the expectations that were placed on him in terms of performance management, and they were very much encoded in performance metrics. Papers in the right journals, grants, okay? And so this is a really important reminder of the human cost that is behind all of this. It's the most extreme case. I hope it never happens again. But so we are very much, and so this sort of triggered then an awful lot of internal reflection. I was part of an internal committee that looked at how we actually use performance metrics at Imperial College. We're quite a task, goal-orientated institution, and that created a recommendation to use profiles, not metrics, and think about, yes, we're interested in people who do great research, but we're also interested in having people who do great teaching, and people who are prepared to step up and be head of department for 5 years, and people who engage with government policy or do public engagement. And so we're trying to create a broader spectrum of things that we do to get it. So eventually we signed. And actually it was Nick Jennings, whose photographs sort of passed you by there, who came to us as a new Vice Provost for Research, and Chris Banks, who's our Director of Library Services, who were very vocal advocates, and actually was Nick helped to crack heads together that I wasn't able to crack together. And so finally got us over the line. Chris and Nick and I worked very close together to do that. And implementing it takes time, so we signed it, and then we convened a working group which drew people from different faculties to think through, what it was exactly that we had to do. And it's about, changing the language of adverts, job descriptions, providing guidance to people. And then we sort of ended up, communicating to the wider audience. And now I do not imagine for a moment that Imperial College is 100% compliant with DORA right today, even 2 years after signing. We're a large university. We have 8,000 staff, 17,000 students. Not even that big compared to others. And it's hard to get to every corner. So it has to be an ongoing conversation. One of the things that we did do was an event a little bit like today, where we brought people together to sort of talk about, why we had signed and what it meant. And again, we had sort of Nick presenting. We had Lizzie Gadd from Loughborough, who's a very thoughtful commentator on this space. Chris Jackson is a professor in earth sciences and a very important sort of open science advocate, and just got people around to discuss. The whole proceedings are on YouTube, if you like, so it's a commitment to open science, but it is 3 hours long, so you might want to jump through different. One of the things that, it's difficult for a single university to act, and so it's really about understanding that we are not alone. University College London signed DORA before us, and has done a really good job, I would say, of implementing it. And Paul Ayres, who's at UCL, I keep wanting to say UCD now that I'm in Dublin, but UCL, is part of that LERU Open Science group that Helen mentioned. And it was very interesting work done at Utrecht, where they've really done a sort of big consultative piece of work, workshopping how it is that they are going to recruit and hire. And they've come up with using a biosketch idea to manage that process. They get people to write a short essay addressing 5 questions, which are looking at the 5 things that they think are important. DORA is trying to be more and more proactive about actually helping to build and develop tools for evaluation, to think through some of the issues. We've recently run workshops at different conferences on looking at the problem of bias in research evaluation, and we've got a meeting coming up jointly with the HHMI in Washington, looking at trying to get more engagement with North American universities with the initiative. I'm going to Europe is thinking about this too. Open science is really very important for us. Plan S is coming down the line. If you haven't heard of Plan S, then God help you. But the important thing, so Plan S is about getting to open access really quickly, but an important component of that is building in new thinking about research assessment, and that really has to be it. So we do have to assess research. It's not a task that we can avoid, but we have to really think about how we define success. And for me, these are the sort of the really main attributes. It's reliable, rapidly communicated, good research, researchers who collaborate, feel a duty of care, and a research system that values the people within it. How do we get there? It's a kind of utopian vision. There's a very good book on how to utopia for realists. If we want change, we need to be unrealistic, unreasonable, and impossible. Now, I agree partly with that, but I think you also have to be realistic, reasonable, and think about what's possible. Okay, this is academics, what we're dealing with, after all. And so there's a wonderful piece in the New Yorker by Atul Gawande about how it is that you get people to change how they do things when they have got an established mode. And it really is about talking to people. So I'm really glad to be finally to be part of this procedure at Trinity. I wish you well. I'm very happy to take questions if there's any last questions. And it's just really a reminder, open science, open scholarship is for everyone. We have to think about everyone. And this is the last time that Britain as a country was at ease with itself. Thank you very much.
I'd like to extend a huge thank you there to Professor Curry for his very thought-provoking presentation to us this morning. And I suppose I'd like to open the floor. We have about 15 minutes now for questions. So maybe think about your questions. And in the meantime, Professor Curry, I might just ask you, do you find that more established researchers are growing in their support of DORA? What are early researchers' views at this point?
I would say that the early career researchers are more on board with it.
Okay.
I think they're younger. They haven't really, they haven't forgotten their ideals. Although, as I said in some of my remarks, they are much more savvy, I think, than perhaps I was at the same stage, and they're much more aware of the risks that they might be taking. And some of them, fair play to them, they are taking risks. But I would always, say if one of them came to me for advice, you've only got one life, and you may have to be a bit selfish. You have to think about your career. And there is a game out there, and and I don't think it's fair to expect early career researchers to be taking all the risks that associated with changing the system that people like me didn't take when I was planning up the greasy bubble. Okay? And I do think it is incumbent on more senior researchers, and I guess I count as a more senior researcher these days, because I don't like to think about it, but and I would like to see more people like Randy Shekman. Randy Shekman is a cell biologist, won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work. And on the day that he got the award, he said, "I am boycotting Nature, Science and Cell because I think publication in these glamour journals is ultimately detrimental to science." And so it's a great PR move. Okay, he's a PR genius. He was sort of criticised as being totally hypocritical because if you look at his CV, it's Nature, Cell and Science paper. Okay, so he's obviously a very good researcher. But and he clearly had a discussion with his rather large group who contained people at all different stages, and I think someone like that can mitigate risks for them, because if you're working in Randy Shipman's group, that's already quite a good thing to put on your CV, and he can in his letter recommendation write, we have a lab policy, this is what we do great work, I think what X has done is fabulous for trade, etc., etc. And so by doing that they can mitigate the risk for young people. But there aren't many Randy Shekmans, and so there aren't enough Randy Shekmans in the world, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's open to the floor. Who would like to ask a question? Please go ahead.
You mentioned equity as a big part of the open scholarship communication. From the side of DORA, what kind of recommendations can you give to organizations or funders in terms of giving more support to, say, publishing media, platform journal that specifically focus on inclusiveness and equity, as opposed to journals where people still have some barriers to publish, whether it's financial or inconvenience, whether they have to go through some process where other group of people don't. But fundamentally, there are equitable and non-equitable. How would you recommend to give a recommendation to support the equitable ones?
Okay, so that's a very important question. So it's one that's a bit tricky for me to answer it. So I have to be very careful. So DORA is about improving research assessment, and clearly, as I said in my talk, these issues of research assessment and open science and open access are very interlocking, and so DORA doesn't take a formal position on open access or what's the best way to do it and whatnot. And so we are keen to be part of that conversation. I personally have my views, but I take my DORA hat off. I've got particular views about how important open access is. And I am very aware that if you think looking at institutions in the global south, particularly South America has a very healthy sort of university-based infrastructure for publishing in open access. But one of the things that they struggle with is that many of those journals are then not indexed in Scopus, and so some of the universities say, well, they don't count. It's not in an international database, and it doesn't count, and that's a terrible thing to turn around and tell people. And one of the things that's been really good about bringing together an international advisory board is that those voices from South America, from Africa, from India, China, we are hearing them much more. And so we will try much harder to give a platform to voices from the global south in that debate. Plan S, generally I'm pro Plan S, but I know that there has been reaction from some communities. You have to think about the humanities, for example. There's a lot less money spent on the humanities compared to STEM subjects, and so there's an inequity there that I think we have to be alive to. And I think there's a different relationship that humanities scholars have with their published works than sort of natural scientists like myself would have. And in terms of funding modes, then I think there's still a lot of work to do to think it through ways of supporting open science that actually are economically sustainable.
I just want to mention that I also asked about specifically equity for authors, because there is a lot of focus on equity for readers, and it's been advanced, but there's still problem of equity for authors in terms of barriers to publish.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I think that is one of the key issues that is still being tackled. I think in the clarification on the implementation of Plan S has been more acknowledgement has been given of that problem. And there was a joint statement from the Coalition S and the organisation in South America about aspiring to the same goal, but still needing to work through the economics of it, so as not to disadvantage authors from the global south. That is very important.
Okay, more questions? The lady in the blue here.
Go ahead. Hi, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how funders can manage reviewers effectively who insist on focusing or continue to focus on journal impact factors and journal destinations despite providing guidance that signed up to DORA. We want them to look beyond that and the quality, reach and openness. What does one do?
Okay, well, it may be easier for funders to control the behaviour of panel members who then meet to discuss grants. Reviewers, very hard to sort of check in. One can give up guidelines till you're blue in the face, but I think it is really important, because I don't think the research community will move. It doesn't really matter if a funder signs DORA, for example. If researchers don't believe that they want to see the names of the journals in my CV, they want to let me help you by giving you the impact factor tool. Because there's an opportunity to say, okay, tell me about your 4 best papers, and you tell me why you think they are important contributions to your field, or why they matter beyond the academy. And so get the applicant to do the work of doing that explanation, and just get them to pull out the things that they see as valuable. I am tempted to encourage funders to strip out the names of journals in CVs, as it were. And even there is bias even associated obviously with names. There's gender bias potentially, and there's work to show that if your evaluation process when you're a funder focuses on the case for support, why you want the money, rather than the identity of the investigator, then you get more equitable results. Certainly in terms of gender balance and outcomes, and ethnicity is harder to manage, but the more one can anonymize things and focus on the science and the scholarship, the more equitable results one gets. And so it's about having credible processes, and your applicants and your community really believing that you will do it, and that will help to release people from the ball and chain that is I need $5,000 to publish in Nature Communications, because that will do open access, but it's also getting a journal with the name Nature in the name. So.
Thank you. Just one more question.
My question is essentially the same. So,
okay, the lady in the red here. So.
I am around for the rest of the day, so please buttonhole me or come up and shout at me if I said something outrageous.
yeah, I just wanted to say how much I appreciated your comment to the first question about the risk that early career researchers are taking, and shouldn't they expect to take all of these risks. I'd be curious to know, for me, it's the very first time that I have heard that reflected back to me by a senior researcher, by a senior academic. And so I'm curious to know if you've had that reflection from an early career researcher before, and also how many other senior academics are actively articulating the risks that we are expected to take. So that's number one. I'm speaking from research at the Science Policy Interface, where I hear calls more and more and more to do this engaged kind of research without any recognition of the risks that we're being asked to take. And actually I've just written a draft book chapter on it. And my second question, well, it's really a comment. When you talked about the general kind of DORA advices not to use journal impact factors in hiring, promotion or funding decisions. What about in redundancy decisions? That's also something from personal experience.
Okay, I guess I was involved in writing the declaration, but I would have thought redundancy was kind of it would be obvious that the same would apply to redundancy situations. And in terms of then, thinking of the risks of early career researchers, well, as I said, there aren't enough Randy Checkmans in the world, so there aren't enough people that are doing that. And I would like, I'd like to see the Nobel Committee come out and say something about this, or national academies. If someone's elected a fellow of the Royal Society in the UK, what are you doing that to prove? You've done it, and so you can start to think more largely about it. But from my own point of view, I joined Imperial 24 years ago as a new lecturer, and without it ever being written down, I kind of knew it was about papers, grants, do a bit of teaching, keep your nose clean, papers and grants, and by the way, did I forget to mention papers and grants again? And you kind of knew that was the writing on the wall, and I played the game with the best. But it was only when I actually started to write a blog that actually, as a working academic, I really started to think about what is the system, how does the system work, what are all the other stuff that we do as an academic. And it kind of opened my eyes a bit, so I'm a slow learner, let me put it that way. It really is about all of the major stakeholders with the power. I have to flip through my slide, and my timekeeping is problem. But there's a link to a report which was done in Europe on the future of scholarly communication, and they recognise the freedom that funders have to act, because funders are the one organisation in this whole game that are not ranked in some way by, so the academics are ranked, the university are ranked, journals are ranked, funders are not, so they have the freedom to move. And I think we need funders to use that freedom to try and mitigate those risks. And it really is about reorienting research assessment. So if you are doing public engagement work, that's really important. And it's really important to stand out, and we need to recognise and reward that. And it's really got to be baked into the system. And we're moving in that direction, but we're still a long way. And Imperial is, we're still on a journey.
Thank you very much, Professor Curry, and thank you for participating. And as Professor Curry says, he will be with us for the rest of the morning. Thank you.
I'm a trained sign language interpreter. I have been gesturing madly to say stop, but this hasn't worked terribly well so far. But something, I'm glad that we didn't stop, because I think that has been really, really helpful, inspiring and provoking, and I'm sure you're going to be inundated with lots of questions across the morning, Stephen. However, it is incumbent upon us to move along, and our next presenters are going to talk to us about Trinity's research assessment metrics. We are delighted to have Niamh Brennan, the Programme Manager for Research Informatics, and then followed by Sarah Bauman, who is our Director of Strategic Engagement and Impact at the Trinity Centre for Ageing and Intellectual Disability. This time I'll be jumping out of my chair to stop you, so you've been warned, and I think we may actually, after this session, just need to cut the question time a little bit in order to get ourselves back on track. But we will have lots of time then to keep talking. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. I'm going to set myself on a timer as well, so see how that works out this time round. Thanks very much to Professor Curry. That's actually very inspiring. What I'm going to present is not an advertisement or showing a definition of best practice. What we're talking about is the real world of evaluation and just some examples in 10 minutes. I'm not saying that this is an example to follow, as I say. So we've no research excellence framework in Ireland. That means we've no research assessment, right? Wrong. No, we've got quite a lot of research assessment. Unfortunately, because we don't have a national system, we have to invent our own. And we have a huge amount of activity going on here. Some could say there's a certain lack of transparency, and some could call it smoke and mirrors at an institutional level, and indeed at a a national level, but there has been a major effort, especially with the Higher Education Authority in Ireland, to try and get some clarity in this system. So let's see what we've got here. Well, the 4 A's of research impact assessment are advocacy, analysis, accountability and allocation. Supposedly that's why we're doing this. There's no mention of equity in there from Mark Taylor in NIH, but we might take a look at it later on. So, but as I said, this is about the world that we're in right now, and particularly in this country, where we have been struggling to some extent. Just bear in mind that we were bailed out by the IMF, I'm just saying, not so long ago, so that we have some very real issues about resourcing in our country. So within Trinity, like with many others, we use a current research information system, the research support system, and we've been doing this ever since 2002. Our idea with this is to maximise impact and save researchers' time, and I'll leave you to decide which one of those two things is best. Everybody thinks saving the researchers' time is probably the best thing we could possibly do. So it came about in 2002, our academic strategy, our Trinity's university strategic plan called for an integrated management system to help monitor our progress in research and scholarship and help manage their support. So there's some nice words in there. There's helping and monitoring our progress and managing and support. That's what that's about, right? And that's something that I've always held to this. I come from a library background, but was asked to get involved in this by the Dean of Research at that time, a long time ago. And ever since that time, we've had this joint effort between the library, the research office, IT services, and the Office of the Dean of Research, led by a series of Dean of Researchers managing this effort. Probably the most integrated information system in Trinity. Hopefully there's nobody here from IT services to contradict me on this. The Trinity Research Support System has grown over the years in response to the requirements of the community and of the decision makers within the university. There was a forum that was set up at the very beginning which represented all aspects of our university life, especially the academic community in all faculties. And every now and again I remind them, you designed this system, you know. Also, we built it ourselves. We didn't contract it out. So that's a really great opportunity for us to actually decide on what we gather. So we base it on research profiles by request from our researchers and collect information on, yes, the bibliographic and bibliometric metadata and systems, but also esteem indicators and a number of other areas that I'll talk about in just a little bit more detail in a minute. And because we collect all that information, how we save time by pulling in data from HR and from various different other systems, once the information is there, our researchers are told you will not be asked for this again anywhere else, right? Because they were absolutely moithered with being constantly asked for the same reports, but slightly differently, you know, sort of presented in different ways. So there's all kinds of internal processes on reporting, an annual report, junior, senior, clinical promotions and tenure, the various analytics, quality reviews, strategic analytics, comparative analytics, faculty research metrics, all of these areas. Most of the time, all we ask for people is to provide their information once. Oh, sorry, I just want to go back there to see if I can go back again to the other one there. What I wanted to do with that, I won't go backwards, is to show the open access repository is right in the centre of that, right? And was built like that. Our research is not siloed in the library, which has been in a lot of other institutions. This is something, I'm sorry, that's no disrespect for people who are managing institutional repositories and libraries. Just that this was built right into the heart of research information systems from the very beginning in 2005. So it's very possible for us and very easy for us to create and to report on journal impact, on open science. This is some of the data that we capture in the research support system. As I mentioned, profiles. You know, the usual types of information, but also information on entrepreneurial ventures, philanthropic ventures, service to discipline and society, and so on. And also we can have a look, I'll just hop in on collaborations, the affiliation with the various themes, awards and honours, you know, administrative roles. Publications covers all research works, this huge range of about 50 research works, and I see our former Dean of Research, Professor Vinnie Cahill down there, who officiated and really managed this process of building in over 50 research outputs that were approved with a huge amount of work by the Royal Irish Academy's report on KPIs for arts and humanities in particular. That means that our symphonies can be counted, our works of poetry and fiction can be counted, alongside and equal to our journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles, etc. So I'm not saying that we have this sorted out. All I'm saying is that this at least was a response from the community that we tried to give. We've got a whole lot of more work to do in this area, as anybody working in this area knows, but we're starting to work in this area. The new indicators and measures in Trinity are around civic engagement and involvement, tracking engagement with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, collaborations, interdisciplinarity is such a big thing, national and international leadership roles, public patient involvement in those grants, in those publications. I know the research works. Alternative metrics, we're using altmetric.com at the moment. Open science metrics, which we were reporting on as part of the HEA Compact at one point. Sarah Bowman, who's going to speak next, is on the research impact case studies, and she's going to give you a lot more information about where we're going with that, and being able to look at it all, as Professor Curry mentioned, from the gender perspective. So that's what happens when you own your own data and you're able to manage it yourself. You can flick that that focus in various different ways, so we can decide amongst ourselves as a community what we're going to capture and to report on. At the moment, I mentioned it's not all good. We have all of these analytics and reports, and they're pretty much based on publications and the usual metrics. Hand on heart. Faculty research metrics, the promotions and tenure process. We've got exports to the accreditation system. I was talking to Marilee earlier. Are we going to even mention the ABS journal rankings? Professor Curry, I'm sure you've got something to say about these business schools around the world that are locked into this external view of quality for the starring of those journals, and more, and a lot more. Just to kind of mention a couple of examples here, just want to go back to my timing here. So, of course, many of us who are in the room here know and love the HEA's Higher Education System Performance Framework. This is the second round of this that we're going through. So that involves, I say it's not a research assessment exercise, but it is a performance-based research funding allocation model, which allows for a broad base of performance indicators plus compacts, as they call them, with each institution. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. These are the high-level targets because Lorraine has told me I have 1 minute. I thought I had a little bit more than that. I thought I had 10 minutes for this session. So I'm going to go very quickly through it. So in Trinity, our compact is mostly based in research around increasing research projects between enterprise and the public service system and securing more funding. So there's our funding again. There's 200 indicators, however, that we are supposed to report on. If you have a look at this, you will not see the journal impact factor anywhere in this. You will see publication metrics. You'll see open science metrics. The percentage of publications deposited in open access repositories. Isn't that nice? The numbers of researchers trained in fair data management. How enlightened. The thing is, we need to work together on the definitions around these areas and also engaged research, all of these areas. The definitions around them, though, have yet to be worked out. I do want to mention our faculty research metrics in Trinity, which accounts for 20% of our school's annual budgets. It's an annual cycle. What's interesting about each faculty, each school and each faculty have come together on a faculty basis to decide on what the appropriate metrics are for those areas. Now that's quite interesting. It is subject to review, so let's see what happens. Some interesting things to pick out of it. Arts, humanities and social sciences have chosen the full range of these areas. Can I just have another minute? As I say, they count grant submissions, acknowledging the amount of effort that goes into the submissions, but not the grant awards. Isn't that amazing? And kind of, I think, quite enlightened. In the other areas, as I say, we've got public patient involvement. Sarah will tell you more about this. In the Faculty of Health Sciences, inputs, not just outputs, but inputs scoring in these areas. And the Faculty of Engineering, Mathematics and Sciences, that their very ambitious programme has not been fully implemented yet, but they reference the Leiden Manifesto and DORA in their preamble to this, so we have great hopes for it. I'm not going to go in, you can see these slides afterwards, I'm not going to go into our promotion system at the moment, but we can see that there is space here, big hint to HR, for the open access publication linked to the repository to be built into the publications, right? There's also an opportunity for people to describe what the main channels of dissemination are in their area and to be able to say why they are not providing any kind of other metrics for this if they're not appropriate for that. Just one final thing, and we have somebody here who this will mean something to. So this is where some of the real world aspect of this comes into. In 2010, I got a call from a brilliant science communicator who said to me, and these were his words, "The forces of darkness are gathering. Because we talk like that, you know. The forces of darkness are gathering." He said, "Our labs are going to empty out. The government are going to cut our research funding. Our labs that we've built over the past 10 years of 1 billion investment in research in Ireland is going to be ruined. It's going to be devastated. It will take us at least 20 years to try and get back to the stage that we're at. Have you got anything?" And this is what I'm saying is the real world thing. Have you got anything that will help us in this area? So when we're beleaguered, I'm afraid that we do have to fall back on some of the quantitative metrics. And here we have the famous, or possibly infamous, Bangladesh story. And the Bangladesh story was that 20 years previously that Ireland was below Bangladesh in terms of its research impact. Pure bibliometrics from Insights. That story went absolutely viral at the time. Dick Alstrom showed that all that has been achieved to date is now being put at risk of collapse because of money, and quoted the Bangladesh story. It went everywhere. Shortly after that, we'll see a certain person who's in the room mentioned here, when the Taoiseach at the time, Brian Cowan, not only saved our research funding but increased it, the Bangladesh story was mentioned, right? So Nature's comment on this was, Ireland holds its nerve on research funding against all the odds. So just to say, here's all the range of metrics that we look at in Trinity at the moment. We're working closely with our creative arts practice people to try and define what creativity actually is, not specifically focused for performance-based arts, although this is a challenge. We want to apply a metric for creativity that applies to everybody. Now that's going to take some time to do it, and it's going to take a lot of dialogue. Also for the performance-based arts, we need to start to look at what production standards look like and what those feed into. And maybe that can also help us where there's no other metrics, where it's blue skies, where nobody in the world understands what this research is about. Our current Vice Provost said at one point, we need to allow for that you're so far ahead of your time that nobody understands it. We need to fall back on this. So, what I want to mention, of course, interdisciplinary indicators are being spearheaded here in the Long Room Hub itself by Professor Jane Ohlmeyer and the Shape ID project. Interdisciplinarity as an indicator of impact in its own right. So there you are. I'm not going to tell you what we're doing with Leroux and about how we're suggesting using some of these metrics or measures of creativity and ways to track them here. You can have a look at that slide yourself. What I will say is that these are the kind of things that we have learned from our experience, and we haven't got them all sorted out yet by any means, it has to be said. One of the main things, obviously, applying sense and sensitivity. Sometimes where in my office it's like running a kind of a helpline for people. Not everybody is robust. As Professor Curry pointed out, there are some people who, for lots of reasons, don't find this a game that they find easy to play. The appropriate metrics are really important. We need to really know what we want to manage and report on and how to measure and maintain it and apply the rules. Don't do stupid things like just using one metric, despite the Bangladesh story. I think it's really important that we own our own data, that we have the best data and use the right tools for it, that we build it on standards and identifiers and quality control, and that these areas are properly resourced, especially in this country where we have no gist to go out and buy ORCID membership for us all, we have to pay for it ourselves. So I'm going to stop with this now. The most important thing, I think, is that we maintain dialogue and communication with our research community on this. Again, I'm very conscious of the Bratislava Declaration for Young Researchers, and that's something that toxicity was strongly mentioned there about trying to create a better environment for people. So I haven't mentioned very much about the journal impact factor, but I do want to say that we continue to want to maximise impact and save time, and I'd like to say that if we can look after our data, it will look after you. And finally, on the journal impact factor, my view is that should be relegated to an anachronistic theme park, or a theme park of anachronisms, where I know it's in people's minds. You can see that we are not applying that up front in any assessment or metric that I am aware of in Trinity, for promotions or anything else, but I have a feeling that it's somewhere in a kind of reptilian brain, and that's something that we really need to work hard to try and deal with. Thank you very much. Thanks, Niamh. And I will also set an alarm in the hopes that we make up some time with this presentation. So what I really want to talk about is, there's no shortage of diversity of the metrics that we can use in terms of measuring our research impact. But additionally, what we've noted from today, let's see if we can get this open a bit more, is that there's a diversity of perspectives too when it comes to how we talk about research impact. And much to Niamh's point and to Stephen's point, depending on who we're writing for or who our intended audience is or who we're dialoguing with, those impact indicators can be selected and used. And I liken this, and I think Michael Foley, this might be one of your analogies, but I liken it to that drawer in your kitchen where everything goes into, like the strange measuring things and the sharp objects that they don't really belong anywhere else. But when you know you need to do something on impact or measurement, you open that drawer, but you open it cautiously because there's a lot of sharp things in there that can get you, right? Or maybe a more apt analogy is a librarian's desk, right? There's just stuff everywhere. They understand the organization of it, but there's a huge amount of for a lay audience, there's a huge amount of confusion. Ultimately, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what are we measuring? So what's the point of all of this? We have all of these indicators. We have all of this diversity of perspectives. Well, thankfully, Trinity launched its research charter this year, and we have a very bold vision, and aligns with what both Stephen and Niamh have said previously, that both the how we're doing and then the what we're doing matter. So in terms of the how, we want quality, intensity, depth, diversity, and openness in our research. And we believe that if we approach research with those values and that definition of excellence, that we will have fundamental breakthroughs, new understanding, key insights, some transformational or translational advances. And back to the original point, that we're going to build a world in which we want to live. So I want to very briefly talk about 3 initiatives that are happening here at Trinity that are hopefully moving the needle ever so slightly towards what we hope to achieve. So this is the Faculty of Health Science Research Metrics. And in 2016 to 2018, Professor Mary McCarran, who was the dean at the time, facilitated an engagement across the health sciences to try to understand what should research productivity look like. So to create some transparency in that space, and she worked very closely with the library, Niamh's group, in terms of what these metrics might look like. And as you can see, there's different anticipated points over this 4-year period that differ based on where you're at in this system. So for those who are professors of or professors in, those more senior researchers, principal investigators, the expectation is you should be doing more. You have your networks established. You have a body of research work. And so the idea here is that we're not penalizing people for not coming in with those pieces right out of graduate school. So the same, metrics that we've heard about before apply, but they're tweaked ever so slightly. So publications still matter, and we're looking at peer-reviewed journals, and we're looking at book chapters, and we're looking at a diversity of outputs. But what I want to point out to, and it goes back to the question about risk, especially when it comes to engaged research, which is engagement with diverse publics. And when we talk about publics, we're talking about for whom is this research relevant? That can be industry partners, it can be members of the public, it can be patient advocacy groups, it can be other researchers, it can be international consortia. There's a huge range of publics, policymakers that we're working with. And so what we've done in terms of our publications is to recognize that if you're engaging with public research stakeholders, including patients, members of the public, those policymakers, you get additional points added into those publications because they take more time, right? So we're trying to recognize that the how we do this. And then also there's, for early career researchers, oral presentations, posters, protocols, things that get you into place are being recognized. So that's a nice addition. Additionally, when we look at grants, it's grants that are being submitted or awarded. So you're not being penalized for trying, right? So if you're putting in grant submissions, you're getting some criteria. Again, if you are advancing public-patient engagement and involvement in that research, you have collaborators. So this is research with community partners, not just for or about them. Again, you're getting additional points into your faculty metrics.
In terms of intellectual property, there's an opportunity for us here to broaden all of these categories. This is the first step, and sometimes these are cautious steps, but they're steps in the right direction. So we might look at the diversity of intellectual property that could happen across disciplines. Again, this is Faculty of Health Sciences. Research supervision, so we want to not forget about this core component of the work that we're doing as academics and leaders. And then this final section, which is sort of a catch-all, which has to do with recognition and peer esteem. And again, it's asking for examples of national public leadership, and it's giving points for different elements that are above and beyond just the publications, the grants, which are typically the two that we focus on the most. But in it, so you'll have all of that to look at, and we can certainly answer questions. I'm trying to hurry up in the interest of time. But the second piece that we're doing is we're advancing public-patient involvement in research, and this is an initiative that was funded by the Health Research Board, Irish Research Council. And what we're looking for is to leverage investments and to leverage these complementary initiatives. So we brought together the Graduate Student Union, the Library Services, the Global Office, the PPI Ignite program, the Office of the Dean of Research, along with Access Earth and the Unboxing Open Scholarship team, for an orientation, a citizen science project during orientation week. We attracted over 100 postgraduate students. They went out around Dublin, they mapped accessibility. In addition to ranking 364 places, they ended up validating each other's data, rating, so that we had another 500 plus spaces rated, and we looked at the quality for different modes. But this is the story that really matters. This is Anusha, and she's just come to Ireland from India. And her parents came with her and came to this event. And if we really want to broaden our research community, if we really believe that and fundamentally have openness at the heart of what we do, I want to go back to the points that were made, which is we have to have conversations, right? You can't lose the fact that a growing community involves people. So Anusha visited the Bewley store as part of this mapping event. She went in, saw they had an accessible toilet, but guess what? Can she access it? No. So Bewley's has spent a huge amount of money on this renovation, but the door is too heavy, you've got to pull it towards you, so she's stuck. Fortunately, the managing director for Bewley's International was there that day, at that time, and he came down. And now we've been in conversation with Bewley's a few times subsequently, because they're going to retrofit this door with a button so that it can open. And the idea was, for whom is this relevant? They didn't involve people with a disability in the design of that facility, and it doesn't work. And so what we're trying to do for researchers, postgrads, is to say this is the problem. If you're not engaging people early enough in the process, you're setting yourself up for failure down the line. And we need to mitigate against that risk by making it okay and to allocate the time to do those things. And then just lastly, I want to let you know about impact officers. The Office of the Dean of Research has allocated a competitive call. It is matched at the local level to appoint 3 impact officers for college. And that's pretty good with my delays. And so Trinity Long Room Hub will have one, the School of Medicine will have one, and then the one will be working with me and the Office of the Dean of Research team to look at how we can identify, support the development of, and communicate the diversity of impacts arising from our activities, from basic through translational. And ultimately what we'll be doing is taking the core principles of our strategy, our high-level goals, I'm trying to make up a bit of time, our high-level goals, the actions that we have identified in our first strategy document, and then go back to those metrics, that beautiful fruit basket that you have that I liken to the drawer, and begin to decide what are we measuring, okay? Because it's not enough for us to say this is what a funder wants, or this is what the college wants, or this is what the European Union wants in terms of mission boards. What we also have to be thinking about is all of those levels, way, way back at the very beginning, right? All of the different perspectives, so that the individual, their career pathway, their impact that they're tracking aligns, and we begin to get stories across these different levels that are harmonized, okay? So that's really what we're after. I hope that was helpful. I know it was quick. I think I'm the only one who stuck to my time, so I should get a check for that, all right? Thanks, everyone. Do we have time for questions or no?
Just one question.
One question.
Just in the interest of time, okay, we'll keep it to about 5 minutes, but is there anyone in the audience here that would like to ask a question? Here, clear. I see your hand going up. Yes?
Thank you, Sarah. I suppose one of the biggest things, and this is alluded to already, is the issue of transparency. I'm in this Faculty of Health Sciences, but I've never seen those research metrics.
No, absolutely. And I know, when the dean at the time did that engagement, when the dean at the time advanced that engagement, and I came in through the Ignite program fairly late in that process and was saying, where's public engagement and involvement? But we do need to do a better job of sharing that. And for the point of scrutiny, what's missing? Where is open access? Where are some of the other indicators that we could put in there that matter to you? So
I can just add to that. Those metrics are very new. They ran for the very first time in January this year, and it was kind of touch and go as to whether they would go or not. So that's not an excuse for not putting it up there. I would take I would make a suggestion. The Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences have those metrics up front. Whenever anybody's on the research support system, whenever anybody's adding a research worker, they can see exactly where that fits in to this, and they can do their own kind of analysis on it. So maybe that's something we can do really easy, and maybe then follow on from that with the faculty as well.
Yeah, and I'll just say, when I was looking for them yesterday, I had to email because they weren't up on any sites.
I'm actually split between the two faculties. I've never seen any of these.
Okay.
They are, it's a really big issue, transparency, communication, all these things that we are subject to. As I'm a junior, I'm an assistant professor, I've applied for promotion. I am not aware of those numbers, those...
So we've worked to do.
No one, no head of school, no member of HR, nobody has ever communicated.
And that's exactly what I meant by smoke and mirrors.
Yeah,
We're doing it, but it's always been the case for the past 10 years, even with running with faculty research metrics in different guises. But we've never communicated that. It's almost as if we're doing it with, but we're not really doing it, So it's time to bring it out into the open.
Perfect. Well, I think that actually speaks for a lot of DORA as well as the transparency factor. So, a lot of food for thought there. So, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Niamh, for a wonderful presentation. Niamh and Sarah will be around break as well for more questions.
Gosh, this is a really interesting morning, and I feel really bad trying to tell people to stop talking because people have so many interesting things to say. I think we're going to have a 2-day symposium next, Shane. But moving along, next we are absolutely delighted to have a panel with some of our research funders. We would like to welcome Dr. Graham Love, who is partner in the consulting services practice in Mazars and former chief executive, of course, of the Higher Education Authority here in Ireland, who's going to chair the panel for us. We'd also like to welcome Dr. Marion Boland, who is Head of Research Policy in Science Foundation Ireland. Dr. Evan O'Brien, who's Assistant Director for Impact and Partnership at the Irish Research Council, and David Carr, Programme Manager for Open Research at the Wellcome Trust and a DORA Steering Committee member. So this is a very heavy-hitting panel, and we're absolutely honoured to have you here. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. So can I just clarify, we're due to finish at 11:15, is that correct? Are we cutting it short? If I manage to time.
I think we can add an extra
A few minutes, okay, just so we just want to be clear on that so we don't end up talking amongst yourselves and there isn't enough time for... Can everyone hear me at the back? Can you hear me at the back? Yep. You can now. Okay, thank you. So we've had the introductions very briefly. I'm not going to go through it, you have it in your pack there in front of you. I think we have a major international funder and 2 of the major national funders here. Marianne from SFI, Van from IRC, and David, who I haven't met before today, from the Wellcome Trust, but do know both. So I'm going to ask each of you just to very briefly, by briefly I mean 1 to 2 minutes, summarise the key points, I suppose, of activity in support of this agenda in your respective agencies. And really, not to go into a lot of detail because I think we'll go further on point after that by a Q&A. So Marianne, can I start with you? In terms of SFI, what are the key, I suppose, priorities of this agenda? What are you doing in support of it? Yeah.
Okay, so many of you will be aware, I suppose, that SPI is a signatory of DORA. We're also the only Irish funder that is a signatory of Plan S. So, and along with our other national funders, we're a signatory of the national position on open scholarship. So there's a number of initiatives that we have undertaken, some of which are more historic, but I'll focus on a few that are key initially to DORA. So earlier this year we have adjusted our processes in terms of how an applicant will present themselves in their CV. So we've taken on the bio-sketch approach, whereby we ask our applicants to talk about their key achievements. We also ask them to talk about their publications, but in the context of why the publication is important, its broader reach, its impact, if it's open, what was their role on that publication. We also point out and state quite specifically that we're a signatory of DORA, so we are very conscious about moving away from journal impact factors. So on the reviewer side, we provide guidance to our reviewers, both at panel and remote reviewer level, to review against these criteria, giving them against achievements, I suppose, a whole range of areas beyond publications that they might consider, including mentorship, whether they were involved in education engagement, other entrepreneurial indicators.
Are these quite recent? Some of these activities have been going a while, but you mentioned there's been quite a shift lately.
Yeah, we implemented it fully with our Frontiers of the Future programme, which launched at the beginning of this year. So anyone who's got an application currently under review in that programme will know that DORA approach was very much to the fore there. We also pointed out that we're a signatory of Plan S, so we are interested in the applicant telling us about their publications which are available openly. We do ask for preprints as well, so we've tried to adopt, by consultation with people like Stephen and Dora, obviously the wider Dora group. We've also spoken with the Wellcome Trust, David Carr. And I think many of you will know that we've been, I suppose, looking at things beyond research excellence for a number of years. We have asked our applicants to talk about the prospective impact of their work, which doesn't mean that they have to, deliver a product at the end of the term, but it's more to focus them on who will benefit from the research, how will they benefit, when they will benefit.
What about, sorry Marion, I'm just going to bring in Ivan from the Irish Research Council. Can you give us just a top line to tee up this discussion of what maybe has been done already, and if there is anything kind of on the horizon?
Sure, thanks Graham. Yeah, so similar to what...
Can we hear Ivan? Just hit the button there just in front, yeah, that one. It should go green.
Thanks.
Okay.
So as Marion was saying, IRC has also signed DORA as of November 2018. That is something we're very eager to do. We're eager to be part of a general system-wide move away from journal-based metrics and to move towards evaluation of the intrinsic works of research itself. We're also eager to continue to do things like giving clear details of evaluation criteria and valuing and showing the worth of a wide variety of research outputs, not just publications themselves. This has led to some practical steps that we've made, some practical changes. I took heart from what Professor Curry was saying earlier. I do think we're on a journey, so this is just the beginning. But we've made some tangible changes in relation to our postdoctoral programmes, albeit by partnership scheme and our Government of Ireland postdoctoral programme. So we've changed questions in the application form for the better, I think. So we've expanded a question about peer-reviewed publications, such that it includes wording that is very reflective of DORA. The statement is, please explain why this publication is significant, focusing particularly on the research content. So we've removed any reference to the JIF, which, as Liam said...
But can I ask you, Ivan, are the panellists and the reviewers taking up this change? I suppose that's, funders can do a certain amount in their instructions and their guidelines. I think we heard Stephen talk about this earlier, but what's the experience of the actual receiving end for the funder?
As Stephen said, it's a journey, so to be honest, we don't know yet, in the sense that we have implemented this in our application form. We have implemented this in terms of our guidance, our written guidance for assessors, drawing their attention explicitly to why we applied DORA and these changes and how important they are. However, we really don't know yet how the assessors are going to react. So when we have those assessment panels in the coming months, what we're going to do is ask those assessors how they found this experience, were applicants sneaking in reference to JIF anyway, and to encourage them to be part of this system-wide shift.
Okay.
So it's an ongoing process. I can just touch briefly on open access more generally. We haven't signed Plan S, however we have been working with SFI and HRB and the HEA on the North Statement, which I'd encourage you all to read because it's really excellent. That's the national framework on the transition to an open research environment. The IRC board was really key to inputting into the North Statement, and it's worth stating that the IRC board are all active researchers themselves, so they represent you, many of you in the field are researchers yourselves.
Maybe I could bring in David there. Now you're from one of the biggest and most influential funders, not just within the UK, in the world. So, and I suppose, what's your assessment of what you see both in your home territory and internationally on this agenda?
Yeah, so it's I think as we've heard, it's an ongoing journey. But
are we making progress?
I think we're definitely making progress. I think the momentum behind DORA, particularly over the last 2 years, is really growing. And but changing cultures and embed practices is a long-term goal. If I could say just a couple of words about what we're doing.
Yes, please.
Welcome. So, as a global research foundation, ensuring that the outputs of the research we fund can be accessed and used as widely as possible is something that's absolutely something we see as fundamental to our mission. As most of you all know, Welcome's been a really strong advocate of open access to research publications, data sharing, and generally sort of maximising the value of research outputs for many years. And so open research is really, I would say, sort of part of our DNA, and something that we're really actively pushing both on the open access side through being a key member of Plan S at the moment, and really trying to lead as a funder in terms of our policies and practices. So changing these assessment practices, promoting changing these assessment practices and implementing the principles of DORA is something that we think is absolutely critical to that whole agenda, and creating a more positive research culture more broadly. I won't go into the changes we've implemented as a funder. They're very similar to the ones that have the processes we've put in place that have already been described around trying to encourage applicants to move away from just describing publications to describing a fuller range of research outputs and focusing on why they're significant rather than solely the venue in which those publications appear, and trying to give very clear guidance and reinforce that guidance to those who review applications and are funding committee about our expectations of both judging work based on its intrinsic quality, not on journal level metrics, and around assessing the sort of full and diverse range of outputs and contributions in thinking about the track record of a researcher. What's new from our or what we're actively working on at the moment is sort of is thinking about how we work with our institutions in terms of implementing DORA. So in our new open access policy, which comes into force, which aligns with Plan S and comes into force in January 2021, we have a new requirement that institutions need to sort of publicly commit to the principles contained within DORA and related statements. We are working on some guidance for what we're going to be looking for from the institution for support to sort of show that in practice. We've also been actively trying to look at how we can work with and support institutions. So probably the first sort of tangible action we've taken is that we have a fund called the Institutional Strategic Support Fund, which we give to major universities that we support for activities, sort of cross-cutting activities that add value to the sort of portfolio of research we support there, and we've actively encouraged them to consider using part of that funding to support DORA implementation activities, exactly the type of activity that we've heard about at Trinity to sort of bring folks together across the university to sort of consider what signing up to and implementing DORA or related.
Okay, so I think what's interesting here is we've had the kind of the keynote perspective from Stephen across the board, right? We've heard about we've heard from the institutional view to a point here, particularly TCD, I suppose, this morning. We're now talking funders, and I think we're being followed by individual researchers. So it's nice to get these perspectives. But let's hone in on the funders for a moment. And let's be a little bit controversial for a moment, asking this in an institution. What is it that institutions, and I won't say like this one, but just let's say the institutions seeking funding are not doing enough of, that you'd like to see as funders? Okay, we can talk culture, and culture will take time, etc., but I'm talking about concrete, active steps. Let's be realistic. There must be things, I'm assuming, that you would like to see happen more. Let's go there. Who wants to start with that one? David, since you're from Welcome, I'll let you start.
I should say this. What I'm about to say is not an official welcome position.
Okay.
It's off the top of my head. I'm going to say leadership is the key thing that looking for. So from the top level, committing that this is the right thing to do, that assessment practices have got to change, and basically setting a process in place and dedicating some appropriate amount of resources to sort of making that happen across the institution. I think exactly what that looks like might vary from institution to institution. So, as I say, it's something that we want to discuss and consider how we can.
I'm being sort of, I suppose, deliberately provocative, as any chair should be, but I was conscious of a comment you made, Stephen, earlier, which was funders are the one constituency here who aren't ranked. Okay? And, you know, I think probably implicit in that is the idea that maybe there's a bit more freedom to move, is what you were getting at. I think, yes, he's nodding furiously, so I think so. So the point is, you know, are there braver moves? And I'm going to throw this out to the floor in a moment, okay? Not necessarily wait until the end for this, in terms of what funders might be able to do, because funders also respond to pressure. Okay, not the wrong kind of pressure, obviously, but you know, they respond to pressure. We saw the Bangladesh comment and everything earlier on, and how that was used, etc. So, you know, I've been involved in several, as a panel member, as a panel chair. I won't go too far here, but in several. I don't think it's up to just Marianne, Ivan, and David to come up with it. I'd like to hear a little bit from the floor, but Marianne's queuing to come in. Go ahead, Marianne.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I obviously don't know enough about the practices that are on the ground in the various institutions, but obviously the main 7 that we would fund into are part of the group under the IOA, and I think there's an opportunity there to demonstrate leadership in terms of I mean, there was still a lot of reference to journal impact factors and stuff. So I think that's a very simple thing that could be done. I mean, Trinity has spoken today about some of the initiatives that they are undertaking, but you're part of a group by the VPDOR group, I guess, and so that's where the main universities can certainly make change. I think the other thing, which I think I asked about before, was raised maybe internally, was the idea of an Athena Swan initiative that would be for DORA. So we have, I think many people here will know about the Athena Swan initiative, which is a graded system whereby institutions achieve certain activities and deliverables in terms of gender diversity and inclusion. And I'm wondering whether DORA has ever, I don't know, maybe Stephen, we asked this of you when we spoke some time ago, whether DORA has ever considered that there might be a sort of a set of criteria that a university has to demonstrate so they can get certain gradings of DORA, and that would then make them eligible to submit people.
Can we throw that out to the Stephen? Do you want to come in on that? And anyone on the floor, we can start. I don't want to wait for the formal questions just at the end. If you feel you have something, please raise your hand and we'll come in on it.
That is an interesting proposal. It's not something that DORA has the resources to implement. We have one full-time staff, so we're not there to police, and we're there to encourage and promote good practice and reward. But what Welcome are doing and what the Coalition S are doing by building time very much open access and actually welcome our time funding to commitment to good practice in research assessment. Either sign up to DORA and show us that you're really serious about it and implementing it, or do something equivalent. I mean, I've always taken the line, I'm chair of DORA, I don't care whether people sign it or not. I care about whether or not they change their practices around research assessment. And it really is about, and sometimes it is just about tweaking the process, use a bio sketch on a full CV, you know, and it's those little process tweaks that one can do that will eventually help to lead to the culture change that clearly.
Stephen, can you hold it a bit closer to your mouth, the microphone, just so.
More or less got to
okay. Yes, the front here, please. Just wait for the microphone for a moment. Because I think Marion has posed an interesting question. Do we need to push it? Like the gender thing went on for a very long time, and I think it's gaining traction now because of the Athena Swan initiative, whether you agree with it or not, but it's pushed it up the agenda significantly. So does open access, does this...
And similarly with Plan S, so I think it's one thing being a signatory of Plan S, but it's different being a supporter of Plan S, and I think that question has come up. If you're a signatory, you have to implement according to the guidelines. If you're a supporter, I don't know really what that means. Now, I think I hear your point, Steve. I know about resources. I live in a world of, I please have someone to help me sort of thing. Thank you, Alison, over there, who does a lot of this. But I think, you know, there comes a point in time where people have to show their mettle here.
Please.
Thanks. From my perspective as a researcher,
just up close, I think.
From my perspective as a researcher, as well as a member of faculty here, it's transparency. Transparency, how are these new metrics actually being used, and how do they translate into how grants or other things like promotion or whatever are being assessed and awarded. So it's all well and good to have all these new different forms, bio sketches, list of achievements, ways in which your papers are considered impactful or important. It's all well and good for us to have to complete those as researchers, but we do not see how they are being assessed. And as far as I know, we aren't given, we're not told how much does your public and patient involvement initiatives, or how much does your open science efforts or reproducibility efforts, data sharing, how much is that weighed against that science publication?
And is that a question now you're putting to the funder as well as the institution?
I'm saying that a bold move would be complete transparency. For example, we don't know who the reviewers are of our grants, of the Irish funders. We're not made aware of the panels like you are in other countries. There is a real lack of transparency that is very frustrating, very difficult for researchers.
Well, let me take that and put it back to the panel if you don't mind. Particularly interesting, you gave some specifics there, identity of panel members and so on. Any views from our panel members about the feasibility? It was kind of a golden rule about the anonymity of it. Yvonne, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah,
please?
I'm happy to. It's an interesting idea. On the majority of our programs at the moment, we double-blind applications, so you don't know who the assessors are, but the assessors don't know who you are either. So that's the way we currently do things. But I mean, nothing that we do is set in stone. We're always open to changing our processes for the better. I might just hop back a little bit as well and comment on some things that were said. I thought Marion's idea was very interesting, and this is a question in terms of what can institutions do. I think signing DORA is very important, but like Stephen says, making it meaningful, actually implementing it is far more important than actually signing anything. And I think there's a piece of work to be done by us all, funders and universities, in terms of coming up with a menu of metrics that are very widely used, ideally internationally used, cognizant of the fact that ECRs, early career researchers, are often very mobile, so you're looking at your career prospects all around the globe. So taking the wonderful work that Niamh, Sarah, and their equivalents in other institutions are doing, come up with a kind of a succinct version of that would be internationally applicable would be really useful. There is some work going on at the moment with Science Europe and the European Universities Association, which is actually a task force on research assessment. This may actually be quite a timely moment to look internationally and to input into this process. We as the IRC are inputting into that task force. I think there's a good chance here for us all to put our heads together in terms of what is best practice and to hone exactly what we're doing.
I saw a hand at the back, yes please. Just make sure we got this so everybody can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you.
So I've worked in grant management in Trinity for a long time, and I work as a research manager for Project Now. So just coming from the perspective of this bio sketch, and I really welcome the fact that it's moving towards that kind of full storytelling. But just going back to the funders and in particular panels of reviewers, how do you stop a panel of reviewers looking at two bio sketches which look equally good, but one bio sketch has a higher impact factor rating than the other, and therefore that person gets the funding? It needs to have really strict controls put in place, because this is so ingrained within our psyche as academics that this is the way we approach things. It's all about the citations, it's all about the impact factor, and it's going to take a huge amount of shifting, but it has to be controlled by the funders, and then also by us as kind of promotion within our own institutions. But you know, that there needs to be strong management put in place, otherwise people are always going to be chasing those high impact factors.
David, any pearls? I have a view, but I'm actually meant to let panel talk.
I don't have the. I think similar to what Stephen said in this presentation, it's extremely difficult to know. I mean, we put in place the guidance what we want to see in terms of good practice. We try to give people the information they need to make rounded decisions. But I can't promise that people aren't looking and saying that's all very nice, but this person's got 3 Nature publications and this person hasn't got any. So, I mean, all we can try to do is develop the practice we want to see, try to take people along with us, try to actively point out where things diverge from the practice that we want to see, which is another thing that we actively try to do and try to change things.
Marion, do you want to come in there? Microphone up here for the next question.
I think it's a very good question, and it's kind of what I put to Stephen earlier about how do you sort of intercept panelists who focus on the journal impact factor, the journal destination. I think from our perspective, and we're just beginning on this journey since the beginning of this year, for the most part, we've had a good readout in terms of when you give a reviewer the broader information and ask them to comment on that broader information, they will comment on that broader information. And if they refer to a journal destination, I think we discussed this with you, Stephen, we will certainly ask them, to broaden that out. It can be the beginning of the story, as I think you put it can be the starting point for a discussion, but it can't be just the be-all and end-all. So, in the same way that we ask the applicant to talk about, the content, the relevance, the reach, the openness, we ask the reviewer to comment on that. I think when you have multiple stages of review, you can ensure that you have multiple players coming to the table where you're reinforcing your perspective in terms of DORA, and as opposed to if there's just a one-stage process. And for example, for our flagship program at the moment for FFP, for the Frontier for the Future, which is an individual-led program, there are at least 3 stages of review. So, and from what I understand, the applicants receive the feedback. So we're just transparent in that way. We are moving to publish our reviews. That's taken a lot of work for all the various reasons that I won't mention. Anyhow, I'll stop there.
I'll take one.
Just
because it's on this point, is it?
Yeah, it's on this.
Okay, and I'll come to you in a moment.
This question. I mean, I do think process changes are really important there, but I think we've got to recognise we are not going to construct a process that is, guaranteed to work in every case and is going to be 100% accurate. We're not doing a great job at the moment. We know there are problems, but even when we improve that, we'll still be making mistakes. We'll still make wrong decisions. Right? Thinking through process is important because we'll catch bad behaviour. But ultimately, when people start saying, well, this person got promoted because they did a great piece of work, it's not because they published in journal X, Y, or Z, and they got recognised because they're a great researcher, but actually their team is really happy, and everybody from their group goes on and does wonderful things throughout the rest of our careers, whether that's in academia or not. And it's when you start seeing those sorts of outcomes that it will start to build the credibility. But it's a journey.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here.
So it's not really a new question, but picking up on a question by my colleagues, it was about transparency and a reward of a particular assessment criteria. Some of them are incredibly complex, but also others are incredibly simple, and I'm a mathematician, so I can define them precisely 100%. One is not just open access in general, but no barrier to readers at a particular time. Another is no barrier to authors, which are two separate things, but both are very easy to assess. Like a journal, either it's open to everyone or it isn't, and either it's open to all authors or it isn't. My question is specifically for young people, for people looking for funding. Are these two criteria somehow transparently included? Like, for instance, I have choice. I can publish in high impact top journal but closed, or less impact but open. Document, is it written explicitly that this is one that we reward? And similar, if it's an equitable journal that I specifically want to publish where I know everybody else as an author also has access, is that something that can be written, or is it already written and I can see I will reward it for that?
Anyone want to pick that up? It's quite specific. I mean, is it written into some of the functions? Marion?
Well, I think David can talk to this too. I mean, as a signatory of Plan S, we both are. I know we're in the final stages, I suppose, of developing our policy, which will align with Plan S. That come 2021, any recipient of SFI funding will not be able to use those monies to support a publication that is embargoed and not immediately
So in other
openly
words,
available.
it's an eligibility requirement for funding to be publishing in the open journal.
Well, okay, so in the first instance, it will be, they will not be able to use SFI funds to support publications that are not available immediately without embargo, open under CCBY, all the other criteria associated. Now, I suppose going forward in terms of applying to us for funding, and I think I have a sense of where Wellcome Trust is on this, the question is then, if those applicants have not made their publications openly available, because of course many publications come after the term of an award, so you don't necessarily, and that is the challenge here. So if they don't make them openly available and they come in and apply to you, we haven't quite pulled this through yet, but it will likely that we will be saying you cannot apply to us until you make these openly available. So, I mean, that is the principle of Plan S. And as I say, as a signatory to Plan S, we will have to live and die by it. So
David?
I think David, I'm sure, has a... could you further
Wellcome
on
Trust got a view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have clear sanctions associated with our open access policy. If you, exactly as Marion said, we already have in place, if you don't, your publications at the end of the grant aren't in compliance, you can't be applying until you've sorted that out.
Just to emphasise, I don't think either of us are, well, you're there, we're not there yet in terms of our policy will not be implemented fully until 2021, which is the date of implementation of Plan S. So we have a little ways to go, but if anyone is from Ireland here today, I think we sincerely hope that, I mean, this is a national discussion, obviously, around the whole publication model, and one which we hope to be a part of, I suppose.
I mean, the other sort of key point, if I understood your question correctly, there isn't any specific credit for publishing in an open access.
Is it explicitly written that somebody published in open access or in a journal accessible to all authors is rewarded? Doesn't mean this is the only thing, but just as
what is explicitly written is that the venue of publication, it's the quality of the work that is the important
but
thing.
Is it explicitly part of the quality acknowledged by the funder? That's the question. Is it?
No, it's the answer, I think.
But we have thought about rewards, I suppose, going forward, and that is a discussion we need to have, because incentives and rewards are things that will change behaviour. So maybe there'll come a time when we will have a call which will be exclusively available to people whose publications in the last 5 years or maybe it might look like that, but it is something we will look to, because we want to encourage people to move in that direction.
Okay, we have another question here, and then I'd like to ask a totally different question to the panel. We're going to finish this one.
Just while we're talking about planets, I wonder if I could ask Ivan to comment on that from the IRC perspective, particularly thinking about the humanities, please.
Sure, yeah, thank you for asking. So we are very much, the IRC is very much part of the NORF discussion, which is a very, as Marion said, national discussion in Ireland.
Just say what NORF is for everybody.
NORF is the National Open Research Forum, and that name, open research, was key rather than open science, because we're all cognizant that research in the humanities and social sciences is really important and very active in Ireland and should be part of the conversation. So NORF, I think, is very much the way to go in terms of the implementation, which explicitly states the importance of engaging with and consulting with researchers from all disciplines in Ireland as part of the implementation process. And one of the things that the IRC board and executive fed into in terms of the final text behind NORF was the implementation section of the NORF statement, and the very first bullet point in terms of the communities that must be considered in terms of any national changes: arts and humanities researchers, early career researchers then, and next researchers not in receipt of grant funding. And I really want to focus on those people, because I think it's easy to forget that okay, we're all funders, but we're making sort of an assumption that every researcher is in receipt of some grant funding. Many are not. So the discussion needs to consult with those people who are publicly funded by virtue of perhaps having a job in an institution, but don't have a grant from any of us. So they need to be brought along with us. Something that we're very cognizant of in the IRC is the importance of open research, no doubt about it, but equally the importance of avoiding unintended consequences. We're all thinking this through, and there are very many ramifications that are going to surprise us along the way. So I think engagement with researchers will be key at every step. Something that I think all of us are keen on as well is that a natural consequence of moving towards more open access will be the need for payment of article processing charges to publish in some journals. That is not the only route to open access, nor is it the best route, it's just one route. But researchers will need access to funding to pay those APCs, which, even if they're capped, which we hope they will be, they're not inconsiderable sums of money. So something that I know Marion, ourselves, HRB and HEA too would be very keen on would be that there would be a public pot of money which would be to pay APCs for researchers who wish to publish their research. And at the end of the day, researchers have to be able to publish their research, or else there'll be nothing to put out in open access. So this fund should be available to all institutions. It should also be available to independent researchers who might not even be affiliated to an institution. And it needs to be available to all disciplines as well, cognizant that different disciplines have different publishing tendencies, patterns, trends, and so on. So I know that's a bit of a scattershot batch of ideas, but I think hopefully it all gives some food for thought in the sense of where we're thinking, that we're thinking of all these consequences all the time.
Can I go back, Niamh? I'll come to you in a sec. I'm going back to this. What did you call it? The bio sketch. Yeah, earlier there was a kind of 5 or 6 bullet points I saw there, and I was particularly struck by one of them, because in all my time in this game, etc., I have to say I've never really seen somebody get serious credit for heading up a department. In fact, I've heard many an academic who's an active researcher say it can be career limiting for a few years, and God, I have to run the department for a while. But actually running a department, if you do it well, that is an active department, is a serious bonus to the system, etc. I don't think we had anything, in my time in SFI or HRB, etc., I'm not sure we really ever, to be very candid about it, I don't think we thought about it then. Maybe you're thinking about it now, Marion?
No, absolutely we are. I mean, we have been thinking a lot about it in the context of career active years. So one of the things which isn't in place, but certainly this is a Marion Boland perspective, is I would be an advocate of career active years as relevant to your scientific career. Because I think when you become head, as we know, head of department, or you go into industry or whatever, you're pulled out of your
the traditional
focus,
outputs.
and that has to be recognised. Now, it could be slightly controversial in the sense of, you know, how many areas can be defined as non-career active, I suppose, because someone might say, well, you became head of department, so you've got a bigger office, you've got more important people in the office, I don't know, maybe you've got more grants. I don't know that happens. But, you know, it's certainly something that we are very interested in. We already have a process in place, obviously, for periods of leave around maternity, parental leave, adoptive leave. We're looking to extend that to PhD students as well. So, you know, other periods of leave, I think, and absence from the absolute focus of your work should be considered too. So career active years, I think, is the way.
What, David, anything on the Wellcome Trust view of this? Been, you know, I suppose this is it's a perennial question in some ways. You know, the filter through which a lot of promotion and grant securing, etc., comes through some of these classic metrics we're trying to challenge. And then when you do something else that's an important piece of the infrastructure, for want of a better phrase, like run a department well, it's kind of like time out of the field, quote unquote. And I think it behoves us as on the funder side, but also actually on the institutional promotional side to recognise this. Do Wellcome have a view on this? Or do you have a view on this?
This is straying somewhat from my own area of expertise. I think exactly as Marion said, I think we're increasingly thinking about a whole range of different types of contributions that add value beyond traditional.
Does anyone from the floor have a view? I saw Vinny smiling there naturally on this, but does anyone want to comment on it? Yeah, please.
Yes, I'd like to echo that completely, because I think particularly in, there's officer roles, there are many roles in a university that require leadership clearly to run, institutions and so on. And if people feel that in taking those roles they're compromising potential future promotions and so on, I think we don't get the best people for the jobs. And we're seeing this increasingly for competition for things like heads of departments, heads of school and so on. People should be vying for these positions, and there's a reason they're not. Yeah. And this is because they're not being valued. And I think a lot of this is all about what we value. I mean, do we value teaching? Do we value research? Do we value these leadership positions? Yeah, how do we value things? So if we only value research, then okay, put these metrics at the centre of everything. But it is what we define in these metrics. It's what we say we value.
Okay, there's a follow on, I think, here, right? Get that microphone over here. Shane, please.
Hi, so just to add to that, within academic promotions, we've had a full review recently.
Can you hear at the back?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear okay?
Yeah. So with the implementation of the Saunders report and within Trinity, we are trying to move in this direction and improve the culture and the change around all of this. So, it's not one part that is looked at when it comes to promotion. It's very much research and scholarship. It's very much teaching. It's your engagement with the entire university and also with your discipline and with society. So they might not all be weighted equally, but we are moving in that particular direction. And I know we have a way to go, shall we say. But culture-wise, like you said, it doesn't happen overnight.
Culture takes time. Niamh, you were trying to get in.
Thanks a million. This is going back to Ivan's comment about the arts and humanities. And it's about, I was the chair of the North Publications Group, and there's a few people from here there. So I just want to be really clear that in Ireland we're taking a different approach nationally to Plan S. We're Plan S friendly, and SFI has signed the North document, but as Ivan said, the IRC came in with an extremely robust challenge to the North Publications document, which absolutely requires full consultation for a 1 year time period, starting with arts and humanities. But one of the things that is really clear in the North document, which is launched by Minister John Halligan in July, and it's going to go into a 1 year implementation and consultation period. I'd ask everybody here to get involved in this, but I'd also ask everybody here who mentions the term APC, Article Processing Charge, to remember that in Ireland we have never used this, and this would be an extraordinary departure for us suddenly to turn around and start paying publishers even more money. We just about managed to hold on to our subscriptions during the time of the economic crash. The fact that we built and invested in an infrastructure of repositories for free open access to people is something that I think should be put in exactly. So whenever anybody talks about APCs and funding them, they should first talk about funding our repositories to make sure that they are Plan S compliant, that they meet the standards they need that in order to support all of those researchers who either choose not to publish in the current kind of type of journals or who simply can't. And if we don't do that, I think we're actually reproducing the journal impact factor type of thinking in an open access world, and that would be an incredibly retrograde step.
Unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Does anyone want to give a view on that, Manny? Do you want to Shane over this side, please?
They're doing this on purpose.
I didn't want to give a view, but I just wanted to just throw a question out. So I agreed with everything that Stephen said, and probably things he hasn't said, but I think he thought.
That's a sign of a great presentation.
The point being that DORA very specifically talks about research assessment, but as you pull a little harder, you start seeing lots and lots of consequences of it on the university, and also on the one issue which you mentioned is equity. So equity, I mean, again, there are many, many dimensions of equity, but one dimension that I think is really a critical one is young people and people who don't have a track record and people who have been trying things that haven't worked and want to go again. So the question which you threw out to the funding agencies was, how will the universities help you in terms of how will their activities towards DORA help the funding agencies? But I think the other way around is actually quite important, which is how will the funding agencies' policies actually go to the heart of DORA. In this particular case, I'm going to say towards equity and towards younger people whose careers really haven't advanced that far.
So specific policies aimed at the younger cohort who don't have the track record and or have done a bit of field switching or something, is that?
Yeah, or have tried some things that have failed, have tried some other things that have failed.
Okay. Anyone want to comment on that? It's a hard question, but it's a fair one.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's something we can get better at. I mean, we do have specific sections in our application forms that I think get to something of what you're saying, in the sense of we ask you about people's career plans, they have to give a career training and development plan as part of a postdoc application. They have to give a dissemination and knowledge exchange plan as well. But I see what you're touching on, and I do think recognising the value of failing is important, and maybe we should be more explicit about that.
Any views from the floor on that topic?
I'm not sure it was on that topic.
Marion, do you want to come in? I'll come to you in a moment, okay? Just
I'll
to
just make one
want to
more
make sure you give that due.
Yeah, actually, so Manny, you're probably aware, we have a, our Start an Investigator Research Grant, which is the first program we run, for that first entree into the world of independence, I suppose. And I guess we're reliant on the universities to put forward the cohort, that we will review, because we have to actually manage the numbers. I mean, one of the successes about that program, I guess, has been that we've improved the numbers of female applicants and consequently the number of successful female applicants by capping the number of males that can apply, I suppose. So, I mean, maybe there's something we can look at there in terms of that particular initiative around, it being less linear, I suppose, or conventional, and being broader in scope. I'd be interested in speaking with you further about that. It's not a program I run, but I mean, we could certainly.
I just want to say one fact. The fact, which I think is a problem, is that if for 3 years or so a young investigator has not been successful at getting a grant, it's a huge handicap going forward. So I feel that there's a huge waste of talent in that situation. And if there's a way in which the funding agency would address that, that would be a big help to the whole system.
I might be controversial saying this, but if there is 3 years that have gone by that they haven't been successful, I mean, perhaps it's not for them. I mean, I know you're saying, I accept that there are people who are not getting chances. I was that researcher at one point. I was a career researcher up until the age of 41, so I was that person, and I had failures, and I thought some of them were inequitable, etc.
I'm not
But
anti-communist.
oh no, I'm not about that. Good grief.
Can I comment on that?
I think if I might butt in on that, I do think there is a value in funding agencies having small grant schemes, and that's something I think, because the IRC budget is pretty small, that we have managed to do fairly well. I'm not saying we couldn't do better, we always can do better, but we have our little scheme called New Foundations, which it's amazing the things people have done on foot of getting those awards, which can be as little as €5,000. Often people use it to run a conference or to form some sort of a network or consortium of researchers, and the value of what they do is tremendous. So I've certainly seen researchers get those awards who perhaps haven't been successful in the large lucrative grants, because let's face it, the success rates on those European-wide, not only in the IRC, is so low. So I do think there's a value in smaller grants, because essentially we all know as well how busy researchers are. You may not always be able to do a massive research project, but perhaps you can run something small and therefore remain research active whilst juggling your admin, your teaching, etc., your leadership roles and so on.
I might just make a comment actually on the kind of small grants, wider pool thing. There's been a huge discussion for years, I think, in the funder community, and there's two opposing forces here. There is the, if you like, expectation and weight of a rigorous process that has many layers, etc. And that has an administrative overhead and time factor to it that sometimes brushes up against, I suppose, almost the philosophy of a small open grant that's given out, you know, with much less of this multiple panels, double blinding, all that kind of stuff that's in it. Is to be controversial on that. There has to be an acceptance almost that if we had that, because what's actually happened over the years is funders have realised, and it's not just in Ireland, you're better off from a funder's perspective, and I'm talking about administrative efficiency here, having fewer, larger grants. Because you can have like 3 layers of panels and excellent peer review, etc. You know what I mean? There's a tension there. Anyway, personal view. You were trying to come in here and then here.
Just wonder, I thought these were incredibly informative panels and presentations around the plethora of metrics and the way we're trying to shift to something that perhaps gives a better outcome in our system of creating knowledge. But I also, my heart sank as I watched the numbers of different things show up. And you know, in any sort of institutional process, the more things you try to track, the more unlikely you're going to be able to adapt when something you weren't tracking is actually what needs to get done. And so if you try to keep expanding or even shifting things in a very structured way around what it is we're looking for, particularly in anything which is research or innovation, you are unlikely to get those things that you really don't expect, which is what we're kind of in the business of doing. And I think if we're looking at a system of sort of education and research, that the idea of creating, preserving, whatever we mean by that for the librarians in the room, and disseminating knowledge, that should be pretty much fairly easy to set up just a few things. And then, this is the other piece of this, so fewer metrics on that part. We should make the universities be better at running their business. My experience here, and you can tell I'm not native, my experience here is that the running of the business of creating, preserving, and disseminating knowledge is about the most despair-producing process that I've ever seen. And I see we've got HR people in the room. I know they're under huge pressure, but I don't think the funders should be running university careers. The funders should be looking for research, fantastic, and I think the universities should run the careers of the people in them, and they should do that in a way that makes people want to do research, wants to teach, wants to run departments. That's the job of the universities, not of the funders.
I'll give one comment if I again may abuse my position as chair, but you saw the HEA 200 metrics performance framework. That's a kind of pressure from the outside, which is forcing a system to behave in an obtuse manner. Just a personal view, but I'm just sticking with research. Have we too many? Has the system evolved to have too many? We're focusing on too many things, and therefore not focusing, I think was the key point there.
I think so, yeah. I think we, as I touched on earlier, I think we do need to reduce ourselves to a limited menu of metrics. And that's not to devalue the importance of bio-sketches and qualitative appreciation of people's careers and work too. That's hugely valuable. But we do need often to measure and compare in a numerical way, and we need to reduce that to the most manageable way but useful way possible.
Any other views on that? We've gone a bit metric mad over the last 15 years. I know. I suspect the system will evolve back down to fewer as we hone our skills on this. Okay, I have a question here.
Maybe it's more of a comment on that previous note, I suppose, on getting grants and things like that, and if you would think some value in moving more towards value for money. So, for example, I mean, or looking at really, you know, what you output even when you don't have very much, that can show a real level of productivity and so on in researchers. And if that's ever looked at or encouraged by evaluators for grants.
I think it's a really good point. I've been saying it for years about looking at, you know, the actual outputs and the broad reach of outputs on a particular, you know, investment. So we have, well, a couple of years back when I was head of post-award, we did that. We did an analysis of a comparison between small grants and larger grants, and you know, and this was just, I suppose, isolated to a particular program awards we ran one year. So everything else had to be equal. I guess it's normalising everything else and then actually looking to see whether those who received a smaller pot of money delivered as much as those who received a larger pot of money. And I can say, you know, unambiguously, yes, they did. But that was just one isolated piece of data, I suppose. But, you know, I think there will come a time when what you have done with the money will be fed back in specifically to whether you are, you know, deserving, if you like, of getting the future grant. Because I think the challenge is when someone comes in to apply for us for funding, they're presenting, you know, a whole array of outputs that they have delivered on that reflect funding and non-funding from a whole range of sources, I suppose. And there are big pots of money given, and it's very difficult sometimes to isolate down what are the deliverables on this, and yet we don't particularly want that. We want things to be blended and to be synergistic. But I think, you know, it is something we can look at more and more.
Could I follow that up with just one more comment or question? And that is just regarding the idea of moving towards a bio-sketch. I think, you know, this is to be encouraged, but I just wonder from your perspective as funders, do you think that we even get into more subjectivity, that essentially whatever reviewers you get will determine whether really that's valuable or not? Whereas obviously numbered metrics are something lots of people can work with. A bio-sketch is like writing an essay versus answering a maths question. You know, it's very difficult and very subjective.
People would argue that metrics are too, I suppose. But I would say, I think when you have, you know, when you have multiple reviewers looking at the same application and they do multiple layers of review, you hopefully negate against that, I guess. You know, there's always the challenge of peer review, there's always the implicit flaw of peer review, and you know, I think we are very cognizant of what we would call, you know, wayward reviewers, and you know, not using them again without marking a big X on the name for GDPR reasons.
Yes. Okay, I'm conscious now of time here, so I'm going to take one last question from Vinny at the back of the room if I can, because I think we're finishing at 11:40 sharp. Vinny.
Yeah, I was originally going to agree with Mary Lee, but now I'm going to agree with Trina. I mean, I think that, you know, this is a very complex space, obviously, right? And I think there's a tendency to look for a one-size-fits-all solution here. It's not necessarily the case that the solution for promotion is the same as the solution for grant allocation. And you know, I think we've got to think about that. You know, clearly funders and grants have a significant impact on people's promotion prospects. Of course, this is true, but fundamentally the goals are different, I think, in terms of assessment. And so that comes back to the question of what are the right metrics in different contexts. We've heard a lot about metrics, but most of them are actually proxies. what we're trying to achieve in terms of research quality or career achievement or whatever the form is, And so what I worry about is exactly what Katrina is talking about, of finding objective metrics that we can assess that are transparent. We are moving to a world where there's a lot of misinformation out there. As we democratize the dissemination of information, we're getting to a situation where there are a lot of voices that are not necessarily authoritative. So I think we need to think about what the metrics are that we can use that are objective. I'm a computer scientist. We don't do journals, right? So impact factors were never part of my my psyche until I became Dean of Research, and then I have to worry about them. So I think we definitely have to think about what those right metrics are. That's the fundamental conversation, I think.
Okay, I think it's 11:40. I think it's been a pretty good discussion. I suspect we could go on a while. I had a couple of grenade questions, but I'm not going to do it now. It's 11:40. I think that I really do think the panel got stuck in, and we're brave at trying. It's very useful in a conversation like this rather than banal, policy talk, etc. So I want to thank Marion and Ivan for being open and for getting stuck in all of these today. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I think you all deserve coffee. So we are still exactly 10 minutes behind where we started. So if we come back for 11:55, we shall come back to another wonderful panel from a group of researchers, and we'll tell you all about them when you come back. So I'm going to hand over to our chair, Dr. James Smith, who is a Government of Ireland postdoc research fellow in geography and advocacy coordinator for the Open Library of Humanities. I'm going to just say, actually, this whole process of unboxing open scholarship that we've had here in Trinity has really also unboxed a great deal of hidden talent that we have across the college. And James is one of those bits of hidden talent that we came across when we started to talk about this issue. So James, no pressure, now you have to live up to that. We also have here Dave Wheelahan, who's a PhD candidate in the School of Medicine and a former education officer with the Trinity College Dublin Students' Union. We have Dr. Ruth Brennan, who's a Mary Skłodowska, I always say that wrong, Curie Research Fellow in the School of Histories and Humanities and is affiliated with the Trinity Centre for Environmental Humanities. We have Professor Mani I'm killing everybody's names today. Ramaswamy, Director of Trinity College. I work with deaf people, I sign. So this pronunciation thing is a problem. Director of Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience and Professor of Neurogenetics in Trinity College Dublin. We have Professor Ruth Barton, Associate Professor in Film Studies and Head of the School of Creative Arts here in Trinity College Dublin, and Professor Katrina Lally, Professor in Bioengineering within the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering and Director of Research for the School of Engineering. Over to you.
I'm just going to flip the switches on our mics so that they're on. So welcome everyone. I'm quite excited about this roundtable because essentially one of my key interests and concerns when it comes to open scholarship is that when you ask a question of what is open scholarship, what are our requirements, what are our ethics, what are our behaviours, what structures or methods, etc. can incentivize or disincentivize scholarship. The we is a floating we. So when we talk about we, who are we even talking about? Are we talking about academics? Are we talking about librarians or practitioners? Elsewhere, non-academics, those in, say, the cultural heritage sector? Are we talking about early career researchers? Are we talking about established academics? What type of people are we talking about? What are their sort of differential responses? And as something that we've already encountered just talking amongst ourselves, when we talk about, say, if we're talking about, say, academics and we talk about discipline, what does that even mean? Because I know that a lot of people on this table actually, and I include myself in that, I'm based in geography, I'm a historian by training, I do a lot of different things. A lot of us are wearing different hats. That comes into play and becomes a very complicated issue when it comes to assessing and understanding the cultures of evaluation and the sort of knowledges and epistemes that make up the way that different types of researchers and practitioners think about research and open scholarship. So essentially part of our experience here is to try and think about what does it mean to our members of our panel, how do they imagine certain questions, which will start with me asking some questions and talking amongst ourselves, then open up to you to ask further questions and broaden the debate. So the thing I'm going to start with is by asking our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and you know, something of what their approach. And then to think about a big puzzle of evaluating research in their area or their background. So I'll start with Katrina and we can move across. So.
Sure. Sure, I probably should say as well, sorry that it's on actually, I'm just not it. Oh, yeah, so I probably should say as well, I have an interest, I'm a professor in bioengineering, I'm in the Department of Mechanical Manufacturing in the School of Engineering, but I'm actually on the faculty promotions committee, so my name is published there as being on that committee, so they will put that front and centre. So I do have an interest actually in that process particularly as well, being part of it. And I suppose that's my background. I came to Trinity here 4 years ago into that position from DCU, so I'm familiar with the promotions processes and things outside of Trinity as well. And I think if I would just maybe start off with saying that there are very few positions, very few times in an academic's career where they are told they're doing a good job. There's only a few times which is around promotion, and I think that's why there's so much focus on that particular process. And I think that's a shame, actually, for one thing, that it is so limited. But I also think that that process itself can have a big impact on people's feeling of value where they are. And I think that it comes back down to, I often think, almost that childlike starting off and like thinking it's unfair, okay? And this comes back to transparency and so on, and being very clear what the metrics are, how it's evaluated. There is subjectivity in these processes, but I think at an institution level and across all institutions, linking in with this whole outward-facing, open scholarship and so on, are these promotion processes, and we have to see how we can improve them to have transparency and get to a point where people who are doing a great job, putting a lot of time and effort in, are told they are doing a good job and feel the process is fair. So that's where I'd like to start on the discussion.
So my name is Dale. I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Surgery, and my research looks at assessment of performance and things that impact on performance. I think it was interesting, we were talking about inter and transdisciplinary, how that's becoming the norm in research now, and even I'm beginning to notice that the difference of cultures within those realms, so looking at education, how education is evaluated research versus surgery versus neuroscience. So one of the big things I find is a conundrum within my own discipline is I'm a physiotherapist, and an awful lot of practitioners within the School of Medicine would also be clinical, would have some clinical role, and you find that the kind of level of academic rigor that needs to go into the research is not as dedicated, and there's a big drive to try to get publications out as quick as possible, and the quality of that research is variable. So I think there's a whole other section about looking at how our clinical lecturers and our clinical staff, how they view research outside of kind of the traditional academic.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm Ruth Barton. I'm head of the School of Creative Arts, which means I no longer have any time to do research. I'm also head of a school which almost none of our researchers can expect to get funding from any outside source. Because there is a lot of emphasis on getting in funding, and you can quite frankly waste a huge amount of time applying for funding for which you've almost no chance of being successful. I am myself a recognisable conventional kind of academic. I write articles, publish books, and journal articles and so on. So what I do fits very easily into research metrics. I am also perhaps a semi-professional film critic, and I will be on Arena tomorrow night considering Brad Pitt's latest movie. This gives me an audience of 30,000 invisible people, And this is not reflected in the research metrics, but I would consider that to be impact. But I am head of a school which really, really struggles with how to measure creative work within a metrics system, which, as you were saying, has a space for creative work, but many creative practitioners do not find themselves fitting into those metrics comfortably. The other way of measuring is through impact, which is what we're discussing today. That's fantastically difficult. Is it by how many tickets your performance sold, how many readers bought your book, how many people turned up to your play? What happens if you're a niche modernist whose great work will only be discovered after your death? Should you just die on the job? So these are things that we struggle with.
Thanks, Rick. So I am a professor in genetics and also 20% in zoology. I'm a SFI investigator and a Wellcome investigator. I also hold the Wellcome Trust ISSF grant, the Strategic Support Fund grant, that that supports part of this meeting here. So I was one of the founding members of the board of reviewing editors for eLife from the time it was launched. Randy Sheckman was the founding editor in 2012, and I was on the EIC search committee for the next editor-in-chief, and Mike Eisen was appointed. So, I mean, I've been involved a little bit. I was a professor, after I did my PhD at the California Institute of Technology. I grew up in India, went to Caltech. I went back and took a job in India, a tenure position. Then after 3 years at UCSF, I became a professor in the University of Arizona. I was an assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor before I came here in 2006, funded by the SFI, kindly funded by the SFI. Okay, so during this period, I've sort of been part of many different evaluation, consultation, and decision-making panels in different countries and different systems. Also, when I was an assistant professor, I was given a book by my then head of department, Sam Ward, called Academic Duty by Don Kennedy, who used to be the president of Stanford. So he was also an invertebrate neurobiology. So the idea that academic freedom comes in part with academic duty and has a certain complex environment. So I feel that from my perspective, and I agree with something that Mary Rose completely, is that what funding agencies actually do to evaluate research and what universities do to evaluate individuals and academics should be two different things. And while we cannot really control so much, as academics, what funding agencies do, because they all have their own sort of motivations that come from above and come from their panels, we may or may not agree with them. For instance, there is a fear right now that that Science Foundation Ireland has been going too much to the direction of doing industrial-related research. Whether it's true or not is a matter of debate, and to the extent is a matter of debate. And there's also a concern that the Wellcome Trust, this perfect funding agency that funds me as well, is transforming a little too much to the direction of translational work. Okay. So one of the things about metrics, I feel, is they say something, but they really hide a lot. Okay, and they're really useful for the non-expert, but they're not necessarily useful for the expert. If I'm an expert at something and I see something, I don't care what the metrics say, I have an opinion. Okay, so what the metrics clearly hide, I'll just say a couple of things, they hide a lot. I, as a PhD student at Caltech, was lucky enough to be around Edward Lewis, who won a Nobel Prize. I also knew Jeff Hall and Michael Rosbash, who won a Nobel Prize again a couple of years ago. And I admired but never met Barbara McClintock. So all of these three, the first work, the foundational work on circadian rhythms, which won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, was cited about 10 times or 7 times in the first 10 years after it was published. The idea of using genetics to find circadian rhythm mutants was really creative, really original, completely crazy, but well ahead of its time. So what metrics do is they really evaluate the importance in contemporary times. What is the contemporary use of it? It doesn't really measure the importance of something for the future. It doesn't say how good something is going to be later. And if any place has to be invested in the future, it should be the universities. And I also suggest that the funding agencies would be well put in trying to make sure that things that are original, creative, and different even if they're not mass parametrics, are really fundable simply because of the originality. Okay, another thing which I think that granting agencies should understand, and we had a nice research committee meeting yesterday where Adrian Bracken, young faculty member in genetics, pointed out, is there's an ecosystem. The idea there's one particular winner, and these people have really good CVs or have wonderful statements, they actually build on many, many smaller stories. I mean, I've published some paper, I know how to publish a paper if I had to in a big journal. You sort of have to do many different kinds of experiments to some extent in my field to cover the whole story. But smaller labs can do smaller sets of observations which go into smaller places. But each of these different small things actually inspire bigger stories and help build the bigger things. So the ecosystem, as to use Adrian's words, involves funding smaller groups so that bigger things work as well. And these can be lost in the metrics as well. Furthermore, I sort of feel that, in terms of education, smaller groups educate and train people who go out and work in bigger high-profile labs, and that sort of basis needs to be supported too. Okay, then I don't want to talk too much, although I could go on for a long time, but just to do one thing I feel about evaluations. I can't believe how much energy and how much attention academics are paying to this useless process. So you are evaluated twice in general. Once when you go from assistant to associate professor, and once when you go from associate to full professor. Okay, so in most places, I feel that if you spend a huge amount of energy in recruiting really good people, or people who, and when I say good, I mean people who are really committed, passionately involved, ridiculously curious and motivated to find out whatever they're trying to find out about, and in their academic, duties. Then I think after that, the function of the university really is to just support them. I mean, so you go through your standard. None of us make millions. None of us came here in order, at least in Ireland. None of us ever came here in order to make a lot of money. If we did, most of us are smart enough to have worked somewhere else and made much more money. So if you go through your simple process of getting your regular raises, and then at the time of associate professor, as long as you've done your job, you get promoted. And the only problem happens if you haven't done your job, which is a rarity, or if you've done spectacularly, in which case that's also can be considered in a different way. So I think that proper budgeting and financing of university should assume the success of the excellent people they recruit, and that evaluation should almost go into the background and not be a signal. And if this happens, I think that we will have a university where people can concentrate on what is really good. We can work honestly without fear of being punished or without having to stack up to make sure that we're doing something contemporary, that the metrics will make us look good to me.
Okay, can we just maybe move on to Ruth, just to keep up balance, please?
Okay. So I should start by saying I'm definitely not a conventional researcher. And my field is marine environmental governance, and specifically at the moment I work with small-scale fishing communities in the Irish Islands. I work at the social science policy interface, so I also work very closely with policymakers. Academia is my second career. I started out as a solicitor in banking and structured finance, nothing to do with what I'm doing now. I'm actually a law graduate from Trinity. From there I found my way into a master's in marine policy, and from there I found my way into a Scottish Marine Research Institute where I sat in an ecology department. I was a full-time researcher there, and I did a PhD part-time. I didn't know what I was doing the PhD in. When I asked Aberdeen University if I could call it marine social science at the end, they said it's not on our list, it has to be marine science. And I said, well, what about social ecology? And they said, no, that's not on our list either. So my PhD is in marine science, which gives the impression that I'm a marine biologist or ecologist. I'm not a natural scientist at all. My training has been very much at the science policy interface. Also, when I was doing that, both my PhD research, I did that part-time when I was a full-time researcher. I collaborated for 5 years with a visual artist and filmmaker. A lot of my outputs had very, very high impact. For example, art that was displayed in the Gallery of Modern Art for 3 months in Glasgow. However, I didn't have, at that earlier stage of my career, conventional research outputs, which led to the point that I brought up with Stephen earlier, one of the reasons I was given for my redundancy from a permanent position was that I didn't have enough conventional research outputs, even though I could point to impact. And the answer I got when I pointed to impact was, well, there's not the funding kind of research, 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 qualitative research in the future, which is very engaged and which has this impact, will actually be supported. So we can't afford to keep you. The other reason I suppose I'm not conventional is that I've sat, as I said, in an ecology department. After that I sat in a faculty of architecture and town planning in a university in Israel, Palestine, and now I'm in the history department. I'm not a historian. I'm not an anything, I'm not, I don't fit the label of any of the departments that I've actually sat in so far. And so I'm both, I don't fit in many ways in that I'm interdisciplinary, so it's difficult for me to say what my discipline is marine social science a discipline? I kind of think of it as an interdiscipline. That raises implications not just for research evaluation, but when I'm kind of publishing, where do I publish? And how I describe kind of what my field is. Marine social science draws from lots, we're a very, very mixed bag of people drawing from lots of different fields. I suppose, and the other thing that I do as well as my science policy research is I'm a local advisor in the European Parliament to one of the Irish MEPs. In case anybody knows the rules of Marie Curie Fellowships, I'm not being paid for this work while I'm doing the Marie Curie Fellowship. It's part of, I've integrated it into the Marie Curie Fellowship, and so that's how I'm able to continue doing that work. The difficulty, I suppose, with that I see in evaluating the research in my area is that I want to know where are my points for my skills in being able to go into really, really sensitive small island communities, speaking to fishermen who actually getting conversations with them and being able to do good ethnographic research with them. Where are my points that I'm getting for being strategic enough to know how to infiltrate the policy environment, to build the relationships with policymakers that takes a lot of time, a lot of skill, the right language, that takes an ability to know how to translate critical theoretical concepts in a way that makes it intelligible, to bring it into the policy environment, that can actually plant seeds in that environment with concepts and ways of thinking that might not exist there beforehand. Where is the evaluation that will give me points for putting time into writing consultation responses so that I can shape policies when governments are asking for us to input into responses? Where are the points that I can get for the time that I'm putting into trying to, for example, I had to ask my local councillor to table a parliamentary question so that the government will come back and tell me how could I apply to be on a particular steering group, because I want to be in the Marine Spatial Planning Steering Group so I can have an influence on it. I want to be in a steering group which is advising the government on marine protected areas because that's where my expertise is. In the university, where are the points coming from that actually recognise that I am actually doing this work, that it takes time to do this work, and that this work is valuable, and also that while I have research outputs now that are have ticked those journal metrics, a lot of the research outputs don't tick those journal metrics because they're policy outputs and they're written in a language that needs to be accessible not only to the policymakers that I work with, but also to the people in local communities who need to understand and engage with the research that I do.
I'm hearing an interesting sort of recurring theme, which is that often we, especially the more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary you are, the more you encounter just the sheer inadequacy of some of the current structures that we have in place. And that comes down into funding, like it's, as has been mentioned already, that in the humanities it's practically impossible to pay an article processing charge if you wanted to. Finding models, scholar-led models to get around that, but also just the journals and the sort of the indicators of prestige from more established journals often bear no correlation to some of the work that comes out, more ad hoc, and as new journals arise, you then get problems with prestige and trying to support new initiatives as they spring up, grassroots style, balancing that with an existing ecosystem and prestige sort of economy. So I think there's this glaring mismatch that I felt from a lot of different people between the sort of rules that we're expected to follow and the realities of the sort of activities that we actually do. So I guess talking about, we've heard a bit about the panelists' sort of experiences, but I'm going to open this up to the audience, but I want to ask one more question of our panel of my own, which is, when have they been surprised by something from outside of their area of, you know, normal expertise or comfort, when like a practice of evaluation or disciplinarity or funding that taught them something about other ways they might be able to do their work or limitations of the world in which they exist? And I'll let anyone who has any thoughts about that reply.
I suppose in health science anyway, the measures we primarily use are the contemporary ones, and you know, I would have been involved in a lot of committees and stuff and would have had impact in other ways, and those aren't valued within the disciplines that I'm in. So even being involved in policy writing and being able to show and demonstrate that you have been, you know, you've managed projects, they don't translate across to funding applications then. And even in my own experience, having applied for funding grants, one of the major flaws in the reviews was my limited experience, and that's even with a whole team of experts in it.
What do you learn about the process? And the second is, how did it help your research in any way? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. So the process, I think, depends on how far outside your expertise it is. I've been on some university committees here, including the committee to promote people to personal chairs, and I had the pleasure of being on, having to decide how good an expert on 6th century popes was. And you know, the sheer ridiculousness of that was what it brought home to me. I think that one really should be trusting experts, and especially in this current time, when you complain to the politicians and things of not trusting experts, we really have to trust experts. They make mistakes, but you just take the expert opinion. That's my view. But slightly away from your field, all sorts of surprising things happen. We just had a conversation here about sleep deprivation. That, you know, I have some theories about the effect of sleep on cognition. There's somebody working on sleep deprivation in humans. Mixing up expertise has huge benefits.
It's quite difficult maybe to measure, but again in different areas that can have much greater impact in lots of ways than purely like journal publications and so on. But I think maybe echoing what Maddie's saying there as well, though, not just relying on experts, but actually relying on individuals as well. This goes back to this whole bio sketch, but actually individuals and individuals' integrity themselves to say, you know, I believe that what I'm doing has impact in so many ways. And actually the individuals themselves are probably the best placed to say that, articulate that as well, you know, as they possibly can, and make that argument that their particular unique area of expertise, which no expert might be able to particularly give an informed, you know, an accurate informed decision on, but that individual can say why and where they see in the future having impact and where it already has impact, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose, I would just come in on you know, in a discipline where there is virtually no funding. I think there's a real kind of red herring which is trying to squeeze your research into a funding pool. And I got advice that was very, you know, that I remember earlier in my career, don't do it. And I think that, you know, the constant pressure to seek funding is really, it puts so much pressure on people who are in such a, you know, a weak position. And I think that would be advice I'd give to people coming up as well. If there isn't a funding package for you, don't worry about it, and don't you know, ignore that pressure. I mean, I did get funding recently from Creative Ireland, which is an unusual funding source, and allowed me to have a postdoc for a year. But I don't see myself getting any more funding for that project, and I'm not now going to try to dream up a project that might get funded.
Any thoughts, Ruth?
Yeah, just I was kind of finding it hard. I was trying to think of why I was finding it hard to answer that question, because you're asking about experience of different disciplines and practices, because that's exactly where I sit. That is like my day-to-day reality, is just pulling from all these different disciplines and practices. So I don't have experience of the comfort of being
really, really deeply rooted and embedded in a field, or just which you can also be interdisciplinary and be in that space. But the space that I'm in is where I'm kind of moving around from all these different disciplines. But that is my day-to-day reality.
And I think that's increasingly an experience that other people are finding out. That resonates with my experience too, not really ever feeling like you belong within the structure or norms of any specific discipline. I think that's increasingly going to be common. I think now we've got a good 15 minutes left, so I think I'm going to throw it open to the audience to ask questions. I don't know, where's the mic gone? Oh, great. So who'd like to jump in and ask a question to our panelists?
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just a comment coming back on that, on the trying to shoehorn yourself maybe into areas that will be funded and so on. I think Nanny as well mentioned it, this idea of being curiosity-driven research to drive towards the things that you're interested in, the things that will motivate you and so on, and that the likelihood is you'll be successful if you're pursuing these things beyond reasons of trying to put yourself into these siloed areas of funding. Particularly, I think, we talk about the funding agencies and the institutions being separate, but the reality is that both of those things influence each other hugely. So if funding agencies, as we know, decide that innovation translation is more important, then people naturally try to push themselves towards that area, and maybe one of the reasons why they don't succeed, as opposed to if it's more focused towards basic research and so on. So while we can say that these two different areas must have their own, operate under their own particular guidelines and so on, I think it is foolish to think that the two areas are not hugely influenced by each other. And even things like, I'm maybe going to say, I don't know if Linda is here, but things like rankings that universities are being, somewhat hit over the head with, or we're being used now, it's in the public arena a lot about rankings. Again, rankings then, how they're evaluated dictates how funders evaluate, dictates how institutions evaluate, and we have to be careful that we're not actually being kind of forced to evaluate in a certain way rather than standing up for how we believe the best way to evaluate. It's, and on merit maybe, not on resources.
I see we have a question over here.
Yeah, so my question, we sort of here to talk about sort of career development and things like that. We sort of are largely talking about sort of established academics who are actually in their roles, but there has been talk about early career researchers as well. So just thinking about experiences myself as a postdoc and other hear stories of other postdocs where they're engaged in writing funding proposals, but they're not necessarily recognised for that role. And so and then when you come to trying to get a position, one of the criteria is what funding have you actually got, and you can't actually technically put some of those things to your name, but you may have actually written most of the proposal, but then the PI gets their name put on the top of it. So I don't know.
Okay, to comment on that, just about, I think that's to do with trust and mentoring, because that happens again with maybe co-supervising projects or teaching or things like that, and I think, again, these are things, you can look at it either way, these are opportunities that perhaps as a postdoc you want. They're also, yes, they do have a PI also, but if that relationship is strong, there should be no issue with the person getting recognition through a reference or program where it's explicitly stated that you have contributed to that, and therefore you can be acknowledged for that contribution. And perhaps we need to put clear guidance, and we work on things like that in engineering for kind of naming postdocs on master's projects and final projects. And they seem small issues, but these are really big for career development actually, and they really need to be pushed for to be defined again within processes rather than done at the level of individual PIs.
So I think that what Katrina said is perfectly correct, which is that the PI should really acknowledge it. But on the other hand, this might be something that the Wellcome Trust and SFI and all could take on board, which is while they don't want to accept grants from postdoctoral fellows who don't have commitment of lab space and salaries and things for a certain period of time, if they did actually want, the PIs did want to formally acknowledge someone as a key intellectual contributor, if there's a category there that would be included in the forms, that would be a place to do it. And I think there isn't such a form, there isn't such a place to give credit, but that's really in terms of the other. I think the funding agencies have to take that on board for early career support. It's a good idea. Maybe one should actually articulate that and push it.
I'm just thinking of it in the context of the Marie Curie Fellowship. Apparently there is a conversation ongoing about the postdoc postdoc, the recipient of the Marie Curie, is not actually named as the PI of the project. That's your sponsor is named as the PI of the project, and there's a recognition that's not actually reflecting who is the PI in practice, so that there may be some change around that, but I'm not sure where exactly that conversation is. It was just something I heard.
I guess that's something interesting, like the new foundations, the IRC grant was mentioned before, but that's that's an interesting one because it does give ECRs a very good chance to put themselves, on top of a project. So I personally look forward to seeing more like that. But it's also, I think, a process of translation, isn't it? How do you tell your story? Which I think maybe is why that bio-sketch idea might having an impact story and research story and seeing your research life and your value in a more narrative rather than metric sense, but that does have a metrical, I don't know if that's a word, a dimension, I think that would make us richer, have a richer life, and also help us to explain ourselves in a more diverse way and, taking advantage of our comparative strengths more effectively. So do we have any more questions? I see one in the back.
There was a question, it was mentioned earlier on that there was a process for measuring creativity. I'm just wondering, particularly the professor from Trinity who is in the creative area, what do you how would you view that as an idea?
Thanks for the question. It's really fraught. It's a really fraught answer. Neve and I have been working on this, and before the time that I was out of school. What we are trying to do is find a process where it's this notion of equity, where somebody who produces a creative work gets the same recognition to the work of a practitioner outside of a university. Should a creative work in a university be accompanied by some kind of intellectual reflective document which distinguishes it from the profession, if you like, outside of the university? And these are questions that we haven't resolved yet. And also, is there more recognition for having your work performed, if it's performed, say, abroad, than having it performed here? And so the metrics are fantastically difficult to work out. And there is, I think, a great sense of injustice experienced by practitioners, creative practitioners, around their work. But it also, comes, who do we hire? Must they have a PhD? Can they have an MFA? Should they have, nothing but come straight from the industry to us? If they have nothing and come straight from the industry to us, can they then supervise undergraduate work, when we expect the undergraduates to write into academic inquiry as well as in my department writing a screenplay. So it's very, very complicated, and this has come up, for instance, in promotions, where creative practitioners have presented their work, and a panel composed of people, this is just what you're saying, Manny, outside of the discipline, look and say, well, where's the journal article? And so there is no very easy answer to that. We're struggling with it, we're trying to make it better the whole time, but it's an ongoing and very difficult process.
I could just follow on that point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Coming from a professional degree where the focus is primarily on upskilling you to become a professional, the entire focus on research and the need for a doctorate in order to become a lecturer is sometimes at a detriment for the teaching and learning experience of the students, and the practical skills in which we learn sometimes compared to other colleges and universities where doctors aren't required, but people are full-time practitioners coming in and lecturing and providing practical skills. There's huge disparity in the actual clinical skills of the professionals, depending on what the focus of the research is, or focus of the university is.
Anyone else have some thoughts they'd like to share?
Just a comment or two. One comment is, I think we really should evaluate only when we really need to for some reason. I think there's too much evaluation going on. The second thing is, obviously you can't get it right. I read somewhere that Picasso for several years was so poor staying in France that he used to use his paintings to light the fire in order to keep warm.
One hopes our staff haven't had to do that.
Yeah, go ahead. don't want to burn my publications out when I look at them for too long. But I see that we have another question at the back.
I want to come back to a point that Katrina made about rankings and this external top-down pressure that we're being placed under, and obviously ever more increasing as we are slipping further and further down rankings. How do we move away from that as an institution and as a group of institutions within Ireland to refocus ourselves on what actually matters within research?
Excellent question. What are your thoughts, everyone?
It is a great question. I think we have the answer. And I think just even there's no scrutiny on actually how those ranking metrics are actually produced. I think universities and our own, the IUA and so on, we can put pressure too on the particular organisations that are with QS and so on as to how these metrics are being developed. We can put pressure from funding agencies, from other bodies to say we're moving towards more open scholarship and that we value other things beyond journal impact factors, perhaps in the research category, for example, but we don't know at the moment actually what exactly is used in a lot of cases for some of these. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you've got it. Yeah, let's follow up. And then.
I just thought I might comment on the rankings, my not favourite subject at the moment. Just a couple of points. For people who know me, my name is Linda Doyle, I'm the Dean of Research here, and for something I obviously committed in a previous life, rankings landed in my office. I think we're in a very stuck position where we some time ago took them seriously, and it's very hard to extricate yourself when you're now going down. And I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is that there's a much deeper understanding of metrics and evaluation and impact now than when this began. So I think we are now all becoming more expert and able to ask the questions that Trina was mentioning earlier. But ultimately, I think no matter what metric you have, you never capture everything. And Niamh often uses this kind of basket of fruit to say we need many, many different ways of looking at something. So I think the only thing we can do with integrity about rankings or any metric is ask ourselves is, on the ground, does that reveal something that's useful for me to know to be better? And I think what we try to do, even though we're not doing it well enough yet, is trying to say, okay, is there something behind this that says, things are not right? Are they not right about our own system within our university, that we're not actually tackling things the right way? And I can tell you one thing that's not right. One thing that's not right is that we don't leave people just get on with research as much as we could or should, no matter what the ranking or metric is. And I think partly that's because research is now a much more professional activity and there's a whole lot of stuff around it that you have to do before you even start. And partly that's because everyone has a million more things to do. But so all I can say is it's hard to extricate ourselves. I'd love to in the longer term. But ultimately, no matter what the metric, even if we came up with some metric for creativity, if we came up with, I think you just need to say, what is the truth underneath that can help me be better at research next year than I am this year? And it's kind of hard thing to do. Anyway, I felt I had to say something given that rankings is, from people who are not from Trinity, we've been vaguely obsessed with this for the last few weeks.
So while Stephen's getting the microphone, I just wanted to say that he said something which was good, which is, I copied the name of the book, Utopia for Realists. So it's a very lovely title, but I do think that the academic... Sorry, I thought you could give Stephen this microphone. No, I was just saying that while Katrina's right to deal with the reality of things that people do, I think I would personally feel that it's nice to start the conversation, or many conversations, by saying what is the core mission of the university and what is its what is its special place in society, and then follow up from that rather than follow up from the bottom very often.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments on the question of rankings. I mean, it is a genuine dilemma, I think, for any university. It's a hard position to get out of once you've bought in, and you don't even have to buy into it to get trapped by it. But so just a couple of points. So Katrina said that people don't know, how these rankings are assembled, and actually some of the providers are actually quite transparent. You can read the details of the methodology, and if you read it, you will be horrified. So the Times Higher 30% of it is people's opinion about your university.
But what people you don't know.
And you don't know these people, you don't know their biases, and
Yeah.
as the dude says in the Great Lebowski, that's like just your opinion, man. And the QS ranking, 10% of the score is how many Nobel Prizes do your faculty have. I mean, talk about a stochastic measure of achievement, which is totally unpredictable. So, there are deep problems, and I think we need to surface those more. People need to know about them. Lizzie Gadd, who I mentioned in my talk, who does a lot of good work on W methods, is leading a review and a sort of critique of rankings, and I'm hoping that will come out with a much more measured and sort of critical evaluation of what they do. They're threatening to rank the rankers. But I think the first mover problem is a real difficult one for universities, and I try to beat my progress over the head with this. We talk about being a world-leading university, and we follow these rankings slavishly. So, world-leading universities really ought to get out and define what they think is important and be able to be proud of that. But, at Imperial we always say, well, is MIT doing this? Is Oxford doing it? And whatnot. And I think there is maybe, if Trinity's in Leru, then maybe Leru can get together and then get together with big name universities in the United States, and then they come out and say, we think these are a little tosh. We do think it's important to hold ourselves to account, but these are our values, this is what we think is important, and we will secede from the rankings. But I think we need a bit of community action.
So our time's just about up, but what I might ask is that I see we have a couple of comments, and I might just ask each of our panel members for a one-sentence takeaway sentiment, and then we'll close with that. So I see we've...
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I just wanted to come back to the point that Stephen raised, which I really appreciated at the end of his presentation. So, and to draw that into what we're talking about here, so I think while it's great that we're talking about a wider and better evaluation of non-conventional outputs, I think we really need to include in that conversation a recognition of early career researchers and those researchers who are on precarious contracts, and the risks that we are being asked to take in that precarious position of doing this more engaged or more creative work that you want to measure with these metrics. And as you said, you're not sure how you would advise somebody on their career path whether to take those risks or not. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that it is the role of those who are in the safer, tenured, more senior positions to start making those changes that will support us to continue to do the work that it seems you want us to do.
I don't want to dilute that statement. So.
I'm not sure that I have a tidy up statement other than to say, I'd love to see the conversation move a little bit away from external funding because I think it just excludes so many people.
Mine's a quick separate point, but with regards to open access journal publication, if there's, as a early career researcher anyway, it really seems that you're publishing in a lower quality journal when that happens, and my experience has been you submit to the high impact journal and then they reject you and they say, oh, but if you pay 2,000 we'll publish you in our open access journal. So what type of message is that sending?
My final statement, I think, maybe just to say, I think a lot of these metrics and discussions and so on go on because we all have limited time. I think I'm particularly representative when I come back to earlier the gender issue. I think that is because we want more equality, time is more important, okay? Because women's time sometimes is sometimes more governed by being carers and responsibilities and so on. So I think we have to just consider these metrics are as guides, not as targets. We have to be very careful that we don't set metrics that then become targets for individual. And just that whole idea, I think people look for transparency, guidance and so on because they have limited time and want to do the best they can with the time that they have. So we should be providing as clear guidance as we can. That's the goal. Thank you.
Now, I think in the interest of keeping this show on the road and sticking to time, although there's so many more questions we could ask and so much more that could be said, I think it remains for us all to give a very hearty round of thanks to our panelists.